Edgar Foster was 39 years old and spent most days repairing HVAC systems above office ceilings in downtown Des Moines. People around Caroline Whitmore believed he was a forgettable man, a quiet husband, a man who married above his station and survived on Whitmore money. He drove a dented silver Ford F-150, wore the same faded blue work jacket every winter, carried black coffee in a scratched metal thermos. What they didn't know was that Edgar had spent 11 months collecting copies of bank records, forged signatures, and wire transfers tied to his wife's family. And the moment Harold Whitmore raised his champagne glass to celebrate the divorce, the restaurant doors opened behind him. Walter Foster stepped inside carrying an old black leather briefcase. If you're watching tonight, drop your country and local time in the comments. I always like seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow burn stories about betrayal, patience, and quiet revenge, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story might hit even harder. The private dining room at Blackwood Chop House smelled like grilled steak, expensive bourbon, and polished wood lacquer. The Whitmores had rented the entire west side of the restaurant for the night. Frosted glass partitions separated their celebration from the rest of the customers. Soft jazz floated through hidden ceiling speakers. Waitresses moved carefully between tables carrying trays of wine and smoked ribeye. Harold Whitmore liked places that looked expensive before anyone even checked the menu. Edgar Foster stood near the entrance for 3 seconds after walking in. Not because he was nervous, because he was counting. 23 guests, 4 tables. 2 lawyers from Harold's construction company. 3 couples from Wakanda Country Club. Caroline's college friend Melissa near the back. And Travis Whitmore standing beside the bar with his phone already pointed toward the room like he was preparing content instead of attending dinner. Travis noticed Edgar first. "Well," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Look who actually showed up." A few people laughed. Edgar closed the door quietly behind him. He wore a charcoal button-up shirt under a dark blazer that no longer fit perfectly across the shoulders. The sleeves were slightly short, probably an old suit, probably borrowed. That was what people in the room assumed. His boots still carried dust from a mechanical room downtown. Harold Whitmore sat at the center table beneath a hanging amber light fixture. 62 years old, thick silver hair, gold watch visible beneath his cuff. The kind of man who spoke slowly because he enjoyed making other people wait. He looked Edgar over once. Then he smiled without warmth. "Edgar," he said, "glad you could make it." The empty seat reserved for Edgar sat at the far end of the room beside a service station door where waiters entered carrying dishes. Not beside Caroline. Not near family, near the kitchen traffic. Intentional. Edgar noticed it immediately. So did several other guests. He walked there anyway. No complaint, no hesitation. That bothered Harold more than anger would have. Caroline sat across the room in a black satin dress, one hand wrapped around a wine glass. She looked polished in the careful way wealthy people often did during painful moments. Hair perfect, makeup soft and expensive, expression emotionally distant enough to appear controlled. She did not greet Edgar, did not ask how he was doing, did not even fully meet his eyes. To everyone watching, the divorce already looked decided in every possible way. A waiter poured Edgar water, not wine. Someone had arranged that too. Travis smirked from the bar. "Careful," he said. "That sparkling water probably costs more than your truck." Another burst of laughter. Edgar picked up the glass and drank anyway. No reaction. No visible embarrassment. Inside, though, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not rage. Something older than rage. Exhaustion. For years, he had watched people mistake restraint for weakness. The first 10 minutes passed under the sound of silverware and fake politeness. Harold discussed a new commercial development project near Cedar Rapids. Diane Whitmore talked about Naples, Florida, and winter properties. A guest asked Caroline whether she planned to start fresh now that everything's finalized. Caroline smiled carefully. "That's the idea." Edgar listened quietly while cutting into a steak he had not ordered. Every now and then, someone glanced toward him the way people checked whether a dog at dinner understood human conversation. Then Harold leaned back in his chair and raised his bourbon glass. "You know," he said, "divorce is ugly until it's necessary." Silence spread just enough for everyone to understand he wanted attention. Harold turned slightly toward Edgar. "I told Caroline years ago that compatibility matters. Ambition matters too. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Travis grinned wider. Diane placed a hand gently over her husband's wrist, but not to stop him, more like encouragement. Harold continued, "There's nothing wrong with honest labor. God knows somebody has to fix air conditioners." A few chuckles. "But some people are built to lead. Others are built to maintain." More laughter. Caroline lowered her eyes toward the table. She still said nothing. That hurt more than the insults. Edgar remembered replacing Diane's furnace during an ice storm 3 winters earlier because emergency contractors were charging double rates. He remembered paying for Caroline's car transmission without mentioning overtime hours. He remembered sitting beside Diane's hospital bed after her gallbladder surgery because Harold was in Chicago closing a real estate deal. None of that existed tonight. The room had rewritten him already. Travis lifted his phone slightly. "Say something, Edgar," he said. "Come on." One last speech for the family. Edgar looked at him calmly, then he unfolded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. "What would you like me to say?" The question landed wrong for Travis. No anger, no humiliation, just stillness. It made him look childish. So Harold stepped in again. "You could start with thank you." A woman near the back laughed too loudly. Harold leaned forward. "Because, despite how things ended, the Whitmores opened doors for you. Let's be honest about that." Edgar studied the condensation sliding down his water glass. He could hear the kitchen doors swinging behind him every few seconds, hear ice clinking inside bourbon tumblers, hear Travis tapping his wedding ring against his phone case while recording. 11 months earlier, Edgar probably would have stayed silent because silence felt safer. Now silence served a different purpose. The restaurant doors opened. Cold March air slipped briefly into the room. At first, nobody paid attention. Then Edgar looked up. Walter Foster stepped inside carrying an old black leather briefcase worn white at the corners. 70 years old, tall despite the slight bend in his shoulders, gray overcoat buttoned to the neck, clean-shaven, sharp eyes that missed almost nothing. Harold's expression shifted slightly. Not fear, recognition. Walter walked across the room slowly. No rush. No apology for interrupting. The conversations around the tables faded one by one until only the jazz music remained. Edgar stood halfway out of instinct. Walter placed one hand briefly on his shoulder. "Sit," he said quietly. Then he lowered the leather briefcase onto the table with a dull, heavy sound. Not loud, but heavy enough that Edgar noticed several guests glance toward it immediately. Walter removed his coat carefully and took the empty chair beside his son. A waitress approached nervously. "Would you like anything to drink?" Sir Walter looked at the bourbon glasses around the room. "Coffee," he said. "Black." "Nothing else?" Harold forced a smile. "Walter, didn't realize you'd be joining us." Walter looked directly at him for the first time. "That's because this wasn't really an invitation." The room went still again. Harold adjusted his cufflinks. "Well," he said slowly, "tonight is about closure." Walter rested one hand on the leather briefcase. "No," he replied. "Tonight is about timing." Edgar saw the first crack appear in Harold Whitmore's confidence. Tiny, but real. And across the room, Caroline finally looked directly at Edgar for longer than a few seconds. Because for the first time all night, she realized he did not look nervous at all. Edgar Foster met Caroline Whitmore 6 years before the divorce under white banquet lights at a Mercy One Children's Hospital fundraiser. He had not been invited as a donor. He was there because the hospital's rooftop cooling unit had failed 3 hours before the event, and the ballroom temperature had climbed to 81 degrees, while 200 guests in formal wear pretended not to sweat. Edgar arrived in work boots with a tool bag over one shoulder. He climbed a service ladder behind the catering kitchen while a string quartet played downstairs. By 7:42 p.m., cold air moved through the vents again. Most people never noticed who fixed it. Caroline did. She had been standing near the hallway in a pale blue dress, holding a clipboard and speaking into a headset. She watched Edgar come down from the service access door with dust on his sleeve and a thin cut across his knuckle. "You saved the evening," she said. Edgar wiped his hand on a rag. "Just replaced a capacitor." She smiled like that answer amused her. At the time, Edgar thought she liked the fact that he did not perform for attention. For the first year, maybe she did. Caroline liked his quietness when it felt like stability. She liked that he listened before answering. She liked his small house on the south side of Des Moines with the clean garage, the organized tools, and the maple tree in the yard. She said he made life feel simple. Edgar believed her. Their wedding happened 18 months later at the Salisbury House garden under gray September clouds. Harold Whitmore paid for the tent. Diane chose the flowers. Travis gave a speech that sounded friendly if no one listened too closely. To Caroline, Travis said, glass raised, who always said she wanted a man who could fix anything. People laughed. Edgar smiled because Caroline squeezed his hand. He told himself it was harmless. The first real cut came at Thanksgiving. They were 3 months married. Harold's house in West Des Moines had ceilings high enough to make every conversation echo. The dining table sat 16 people. Edgar wore a navy sweater Caroline had bought him because Diane said his flannel shirts looked too casual for family photos. During dinner, Harold asked Edgar how work was. Busy, Edgar said. A lot of older units failing before winter. Harold nodded as if receiving a report from a groundskeeper. And you still plan to stay in that line? The table went slightly quieter. Edgar set down his fork. It's good work. Of course, Harold said. Honest work. But Caroline grew up around a certain pace, a certain standard. Caroline looked down at her plate. Edgar waited for her to say something. She did not. That was when he first learned how silence could sit beside betrayal without making a sound. After that, the comments came dressed as concern. Diane suggested Caroline should handle the household image because Edgar was not used to formal settings. Travis asked whether HVAC technicians got retirement plans or just a handshake and a bad knee. Harold offered to introduce Edgar to a project manager who might help him move beyond tools. Each insult was wrapped carefully enough that objecting would make Edgar look sensitive. So he did not object. He watched. He remembered. He worked. When Harold's office building on Grand Avenue lost heat during a January freeze, Edgar left his own job at 9:30 p.m., drove across town, and fixed the boiler controls before the pipes burst. Harold thanked him with a text message. Appreciated. One word. No period. When Diane's SUV died outside Jordan Creek Town Center, Edgar drove there in freezing rain, changed the battery in the parking lot, and followed her home to make sure the alternator warning stayed off. Diane later told friends he was surprisingly useful. When Caroline's credit card balance quietly climbed past $17,000, Edgar took extra weekend calls and paid it down without mentioning it at dinner. He did not do it to buy love. He did it because he believed marriage meant carrying weight without keeping score. But the Whitmores always kept score. They just used a different ledger. At charity events, Diane introduced him as Caroline's husband, Edgar. He works with mechanical systems. At country club dinners, Harold corrected people when they assumed Edgar was in real estate. No, Harold said once, smiling across the table. Edgar keeps buildings comfortable. Very practical skill. The man beside Harold chuckled. Caroline smiled too late, too weakly. Edgar saw it. He saw everything. By their 3rd year of marriage, Caroline had begun editing him before they left the house. Maybe don't wear that jacket. Could you let me answer if someone asks about work? Please don't bring up service calls at dinner. She said these things gently. That made them worse. At first, Edgar tried to adjust. He bought better shoes. He learned which fork belonged to which course at Diane's formal dinners. He memorized the names of Harold's business partners. He stopped arriving at Whitmore events in work clothes, even when he came straight from 12-hour shifts. But no amount of polish changed what they saw. To them, Edgar was not a man building a life. He was evidence that Caroline had settled. One Saturday, in late spring, Caroline hosted brunch for several women from her marketing firm at the house she and Edgar were still paying for together. Edgar had spent the previous weekend replacing rotten deck boards and installing new recessed lighting in the kitchen. The women complimented the house. Caroline smiled. Dad helped us get it. Edgar stood by the sink rinsing coffee mugs. His hands paused beneath the running water. Harold had not helped them get the house. Edgar's late mother's life insurance money had covered most of the down payment. Edgar had replaced the subfloor in the guest bathroom himself, rewired half the basement, installed the kitchen lighting after work one section at a time while Caroline slept upstairs. But Caroline said Dad helped us get it, and nobody corrected her. That night after the guests left, Edgar asked her about it. Caroline stood in the bedroom removing her earrings. It was easier, she said. Easier than what? She sighed, then explaining everything, everything. The word stayed with him. It meant his money, his labor, his history, his mother's name on the account that made the house possible. All of it was inconvenient to explain. So Caroline trimmed the truth until it fit the image she wanted. Edgar stood in the doorway and felt something close inside him, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small internal door clicking shut. After that, he stopped trying to be accepted. He still showed up, still fixed what broke, still paid bills, still sat through dinners where Harold explained markets he barely understood and Travis bragged about deals that sounded too clean. But Edgar began listening differently. He noticed how Travis always changed topics when bank financing came up. He noticed how Harold mentioned temporary leverage, as if debt became harmless when spoken with confidence. He noticed Caroline taking calls in the garage with the door half closed. He noticed his own mail moved from the kitchen counter to Caroline's office drawer. By then, Edgar no longer believed disrespect was the only problem. Something else was under the floorboards. Something with paperwork. The first proof came on an ordinary Tuesday in October. Edgar came home at 6:18 p.m. carrying a grocery bag, his work jacket damp from rain. The house smelled like Caroline's vanilla candle, the expensive one she lit when she wanted everything to feel calm. On the kitchen counter sat a stack of mail, catalogs, a dentist reminder, a charity invitation addressed to Caroline. But the Prairie State Bank envelope Edgar had seen that morning in the mailbox was gone. He stood there with one hand still around the grocery bag handle. The refrigerator hummed. Rain tapped against the window over the sink. Upstairs, Caroline's voice moved softly behind the closed office door. Edgar set the groceries down. He did not call her name. He did not knock. He walked to the small desk near the hallway, opened the bottom drawer where they kept household folders, and found the bank file thinner than it had been the week before. 3 statements were missing. Not misplaced. Missing. For a long moment, Edgar stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at the empty space between 2 labeled folders. Then he closed the drawer carefully. Whatever was happening, he understood one thing clearly. The Whitmores had spent years treating him like a man too simple to notice. That was their first mistake. The next morning, Edgar Foster woke up at 4:47 a.m. before the alarm sounded. For a few seconds, he stayed still in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan above the bed. Caroline slept beside him, facing the opposite wall, one arm tucked beneath the pillow, breathing evenly. Nothing looked different. That bothered him more than panic would have. People who made honest mistakes usually looked nervous after being caught near one. Caroline looked peaceful. Edgar got out of bed quietly and dressed in the dark. Jeans, thermal shirt, work boots, the old blue jacket hanging beside the laundry room door. In the kitchen, he poured black coffee into his scratched steel thermos while rainwater slid down the windows over the sink. The bank folder stayed exactly where he had left it the night before. 3 statements missing. He opened the drawer again anyway. January, February, April, gone. Only those months. Not random. Edgar closed the drawer carefully when he heard footsteps upstairs. Caroline entered the kitchen wrapped in a cream-colored robe, checking her phone before looking at him. "You're up early. Service call downtown." She walked to the espresso machine Harold and Diane had given them for Christmas 2 years earlier. $1,500. Italian chrome finish. Edgar had repaired it himself after Travis overloaded the circuit during Thanksgiving. Caroline avoided looking toward the filing drawer. Edgar watched her without appearing to. "You move any paperwork around yesterday?" he asked casually. Her hand paused only slightly while reaching for a coffee cup. "What paperwork?" "Bank statements." She shrugged. "I cleaned up a little. Did you throw anything out?" "No, too fast." Edgar took a sip from the thermos. "You know where they are? I probably put them somewhere else." Again, too quick. Then she finally looked at him directly. "Why?" There it was. Not concern. Assessment. Edgar leaned against the counter. "Just trying to keep taxes organized." Caroline relaxed immediately. "Oh." She turned back toward the espresso machine. "Probably in my office pile somewhere." Edgar nodded once. "Okay." He left the house 6 minutes later. Outside, dawn had not fully broken yet. Downtown Des Moines glowed faint orange against low clouds while cold rain tapped the windshield of his Ford F-15. Oh. Edgar drove in silence. Not angry, not yet. His father used to say suspicion became dangerous when mixed with emotion too early. An angry man stops observing, Walter Foster told him once during a fishing trip near Saylorville Lake. And the moment you stop observing, people start rewriting reality around you. So Edgar observed. At 8:13 a.m., during a maintenance inspection inside a law office on Locust Street, he logged into the joint bank account from his phone for the first time in months. He normally avoided checking balances obsessively. Bills were paid, mortgage current, utilities handled. That had always been enough for him. Now he scrolled carefully through transaction history. At first, nothing stood out. Grocery charges, gas stations, insurance payments. Then he noticed the pattern. Small transfers, $800, $1,200, $950. Never large enough to trigger immediate concern. Always sent after 11 p.m. Always labeled consulting, transfer, or temporary adjustment. The receiving account ended in 4421. Edgar wrote the number down on a folded service receipt from his pocket. 3 transfers in January, 2 in February, 4 in April. The exact months missing from the physical statements. His jaw tightened slightly. By lunchtime, he already knew one thing: Caroline had not removed those papers randomly. Someone wanted those months invisible. At 6:40 p.m., Edgar returned home carrying takeout from Jethro's BBQ because Caroline had texted earlier saying she was too exhausted to cook. The house lights were dim except for the kitchen pendants. Caroline sat at the island wearing gray sweatpants and typing on her laptop. She smiled when he walked in. That almost made him doubt himself. Almost. "You're sweet," she said when she saw the food. Edgar placed the bag down. "How was your day long?" She closed the laptop slightly too quickly. "What about you, same?" They ate in relative silence, forks scraping styrofoam containers, rain against windows, muted television noise from the living room. Then Edgar spoke without warning. "What account is 4421? Caroline froze. Not dramatically, just enough. "What?" "The transfers." Her expression changed carefully. "What transfers January through April?" She leaned back slowly. "Oh my God." There it was again. Not confusion. Annoyance. "Asking questions doesn't make me stupid, Caroline. I didn't say that." "You implied it." She crossed her arms. "It's business stuff." "What business Travis needed temporary liquidity?" Edgar stared at her. "Why is our joint account funding your brother?" "It was temporary." "How temporary?" "He paid most of it back." "Most." "Not all." Edgar noticed the wording immediately. "And why remove the statements?" Caroline exhaled sharply now. "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this." "Like what? Paranoid?" The words sat in the room for several seconds. Edgar looked at her carefully. No guilt in her face, only irritation that he had forced the conversation sooner than expected. "How much money are we talking about?" he asked. "It's handled." "That's not what I asked." Caroline rubbed her forehead. "God, Edgar, this is exactly why my family struggles with you sometimes." He said nothing. "Everything becomes suspicious with you when you don't understand how business works." There it was. Not just dismissal. Superiority. Edgar felt it settle into place beside years of similar comments. Harold talking slowly to him at dinners. Travis explaining simple investment concepts like speaking to a teenager. Diane asking whether Edgar understood adjustable rate mortgages. Always the same assumption beneath the conversation. Useful hands. Limited mind. Edgar stood and threw away his empty container. "Did Travis ask you to remove the statements?" "No." "You decided that yourself?" "Yes." Another fast answer, too fast. Edgar washed his hands slowly at the sink. Behind him, Caroline spoke more softly. "You're making this bigger than it is." "Maybe." But Edgar no longer trusted her definition of small. That night he waited until Caroline fell asleep before entering her office. Not snooping wildly, not tearing drawers open, observing. The room smelled faintly of vanilla lotion and printer ink. Her desk remained neat, except for one stack of unopened marketing folders near the lamp. Edgar opened the lower filing cabinet carefully. Auto insurance, mortgage, retirement statements. Then a plain manila folder without label tabs. Inside sat copies of transfer confirmations, routing numbers, wire receipts, and one printed email from Travis. Need to move funds before Prairie reviews the quarter. Delete after reading. Edgar stared at the sentence. Prairie. Prairie State Bank. The same bank tied to the transfers. He took out his phone and photographed every page carefully. No flash. No noise. Years earlier, Edgar would have confronted Caroline immediately, demanded explanation, started a fight in the middle of the night. Now something colder guided him. Pattern recognition. He replaced everything exactly as found. At 12:14 a.m., Edgar sat alone inside his truck, parked outside a 24-hour Casey's gas station near Easton Boulevard. The heater hummed quietly. Rain blurred the windshield. He looked at the photos again. Delete after reading. People only wrote that when they already knew something was wrong. Edgar opened his contacts, scrolled once, stopped at a name he had not called in almost 8 months. Denise Holloway, attorney at Holloway and Pierce Legal. He had met her 2 years earlier after helping repair a failed rooftop system above her office building during a summer heat wave. Denise paid him fairly. Remembered his name. Spoke directly instead of downward. Edgar pressed call. The phone rang 3 times. Then Denise answered, voice rough from sleep. Hello? Edgar looked through the windshield at rain sliding beneath gas station lights. I think my wife's family may be moving money through accounts connected to my name. Silence. Then Denise's voice sharpened immediately. How much money? I don't know yet. You have documents? Yes. Another pause. Edgar, she said carefully, don't confront anybody else tonight. That sentence changed something, because Denise Holloway sounded less surprised than concerned, and concern meant possibility, real possibility. Edgar leaned back against the seat and stared at the glowing gas pumps outside. For the first time since the missing statements disappeared, he realized the situation might not end with a divorce. It might end in court. Denise Holloway's office sat on the 9th floor of a brick building overlooking the Des Moines River. The lobby downstairs smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. Not impressive enough for Harold Whitmore, which was probably why Edgar trusted it immediately. At 7:10 a.m. the following morning, Edgar walked through the glass doors carrying a manila folder under one arm and a thermos in his left hand. He had slept less than 2 hours. Denise was already waiting. Mid-40s, dark blazer, sharp posture, the kind of attorney who looked more dangerous the quieter she became. She motioned him inside without wasting time on small talk. You bring everything. Edgar placed the folder on her desk. Everything I found so far. Denise opened it carefully. Transfer records, photographs from Caroline's filing cabinet, screenshots of the missing transaction history, the printed email from Travis. Need to move funds before Prairie reviews the quarter. Delete after reading. Denise read the line twice. Then she leaned back slowly. How long have you suspected something? Maybe a few months. How long have you known Edgar thought about the difference? Since last night. Denise nodded slightly as if that answer mattered. It probably did. People who reacted emotionally usually moved too early. Edgar had not. She opened another document. These transfers, she said, tapping the page lightly. You authorized any of them, number verbally. No, joint financial planning. No, Denise folded her hands. Then we have a problem. Not panic, not drama, just fact. Edgar sat quietly while morning traffic moved below the office windows. A snowplow scraped slush near the intersection, despite it being only mid-November. Iowa weather never committed fully to one season. Denise kept reading. Then her expression changed slightly. You said Travis works for Whitmore Development Finance Operations. She gave a humorless smile. That title alone worries me. Edgar almost smiled back. Almost. Denise pulled a legal pad closer. I need timelines, she said. Everything. Dates, conversations. Any documents tied to loans, accounts, or property. Edgar nodded. I kept notes. That finally got her attention. How detailed. Edgar reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small black notebook worn soft around the edges. Denise stared at it for a second. You carry this around most days. Inside were dates, account numbers, overheard conversations, repair expenses on the house, and notes about interactions with the Whitmores stretching back almost 11 months. Not obsessive writing, observational writing. Facts. Harold mentioned short-term leverage after dinner. March 8th. Caroline moved bank files from kitchen drawer. April 2nd. Travis asked if Edgar still used same signature at Prairie State Bank. June 14th. Denise turned pages slowly. This is very good, she said quietly. Edgar looked down at the notebook. My father told me to write things down when they stopped making sense. Your father's smart. He usually is. Denise closed the notebook gently. Then she asked the question Edgar had already been asking himself. Why would Travis need money moved quietly through your joint account? Edgar answered honestly. I don't know. But you think it's bigger than family borrowing? Yes. Denise stood and walked toward the office window. Outside, gray clouds pressed low across downtown Des Moines. Edgar, she said carefully, financial fraud usually starts small because people want to test what they can get away with. She turned back toward him. And people who commit fraud inside families rely on shame, confusion, emotional exhaustion. They assume nobody wants to make things public. That sounded exactly like the Whitmores. Appearances first, truth second, sometimes never. Denise returned to her desk. I want you to do something difficult. What act normal? Edgar frowned slightly. You think they'll move faster if they know you noticed, she said. Right now they believe they're smarter than you. That line landed harder than she intended, not because it offended him, because it was true. The Whitmores had spent years constructing a version of Edgar that suited them. A decent mechanic, reliable, quiet, limited, not dangerous. Denise continued. People get reckless when they feel superior. Edgar thought about Harold's dinner speeches. Travis laughing too loudly. Caroline hiding paperwork while assuming he would never look deeper. Superior people always underestimated observation. Denise handed the folder back. Make digital copies of everything. Keep originals somewhere outside your house. Edgar nodded. And Edgar? Yeah. If anything tied to your identity appears on a loan application line of credit or business guarantee, she paused. This becomes criminal very fast. That word followed him all day. Criminal. At work, Edgar replaced a failed rooftop compressor unit above a dental office near Ingersoll Avenue while cold wind pushed across the building. He tightened bolts, checked refrigerant pressure, logged maintenance numbers into a tablet, but his mind kept returning to Prairie State Bank. At 2:16 p.m., his phone buzzed. Travis Whitmore. Edgar stared at the screen before answering. What's up? Travis sounded overly casual. You busy? Working. Need a favor later. Of course he did. Edgar crouched beside the compressor housing. What kind of favor? Just paperwork stuff. There was movement in the background, office noise, someone laughing faintly. Edgar waited. Travis continued. Bank's asking for updated authorization signatures on some old operational forms. Operational forms. Edgar looked out across the gray skyline. Why would they need mine? You're connected to one of the older guarantee structures. Guarantee structures? The phrase sounded rehearsed. Edgar kept his voice flat. I don't remember signing anything. Travis laughed lightly. Man, nobody remembers paperwork. Edgar said nothing. Travis filled the silence quickly. Look, I'll swing by tonight. 5-minute thing. No. A pause. No. I don't sign things without reading them. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Travis chuckled again, but the warmth was gone. Jesus, Edgar. Relax. It's bookkeeping. Email it. Can't. Needs physical signature. Edgar tightened one gloved hand around the wrench beside him. What exactly am I signing? You know what? Forget it. Click. Call ended. Edgar remained crouched beside the compressor unit while freezing wind pushed against his jacket. His pulse stayed calm. That disturbed him, because somewhere deep down he had already expected this call. That evening he drove directly to Walter Foster's house instead of going home. Walter lived alone in a modest ranch-style home outside Ankeny near Highway 69. Small porch, neatly shoveled driveway, Wind chimes beside the garage. No wasted money anywhere. Walter opened the door before Edgar knocked twice. "You look tired." Edgar stepped inside. The house smelled like cedarwood and black coffee. "I need you to look at something." Walter sat at the kitchen table under warm yellow light, while Edgar spread documents across the surface. Transfer histories, routing numbers, the printed email, his notebook. Walter read without interruption. No dramatic reactions, no visible anger, only focus. At one point, he removed reading glasses from his shirt pocket and leaned closer to a transfer sheet. Then he asked quietly, "Who initiated account access?" "Caroline, mostly." Walter nodded. "And Travis probably directed some of it." Walter tapped one line on the statement. "See, this..." Edgar leaned closer. "A transfer amount $24,800. Walter pointed lower, broken into smaller movement batches afterward. Edgar frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means somebody didn't want reporting attention." Walter leaned back. "The Whitmores always liked looking successful. Men like Harold usually build entire lives around leverage." Edgar stared at the papers. "You think they're drowning?" Walter shook his head slightly. "Worse." He tapped the transfer again. "I think they're covering holes." The kitchen stayed quiet, except for the refrigerator humming nearby. Finally, Walter folded his glasses. "Did Travis ask for your signature recently?" Edgar looked up immediately. "How'd you know?" Walter gave a thin smile. "Because desperate men circle back to paperwork." Edgar told him about the phone call. Walter listened carefully. Then he stood, walked to the counter, and poured 2 coffees. When he returned, he placed one mug in front of Edgar. "Listen carefully," he said. Edgar did. Walter's voice remained calm. "Do not accuse them yet. Do not threaten them. Do not warn Caroline." "Why?" "Because people hiding financial exposure make mistakes when they feel safe." Walter took a slow sip of coffee. "So let them feel safe." Edgar looked down at the documents spread across the kitchen table. For the first time, he realized something unsettling. The Whitmores did not see him as an obstacle. They saw him as usable. And people became most dangerous when they believed another human being existed only as a tool. Walter pointed once more at the forged-looking authorization structure. "Eventually," he said quietly, "they're going to need your name for something bigger." Edgar felt cold settle deeper into his chest, because he suddenly understood his father was probably right. And somewhere across Des Moines, Travis Whitmore was already preparing the next document. Caroline Foster filed for divorce on a Thursday at 9:14 in the morning. Edgar learned about it while standing on the roof of a medical supply warehouse near downtown Des Moines, replacing a frozen condenser motor in 20-degree wind. His phone vibrated twice inside his jacket pocket. First message, Denise Holloway. "Call me when you can." Second message, Caroline. "You've been served." Edgar stared at the screen while snow drifted sideways across the rooftop. No apology, no explanation, not even a conversation beforehand, just logistics. By noon, the legal document sat folded on the passenger seat of his truck beside a half-finished coffee. Petition for dissolution of marriage, irreconcilable differences, emotional neglect, failure to provide long-term stability. Edgar read the phrases twice at a stoplight near Fleur Drive. Emotional neglect. He thought about sitting in emergency rooms beside Diane Whitmore, about overtime weekends spent paying off Caroline's credit cards, about driving across Polk County at midnight to bring Caroline medicine when she got the flu during a work conference. The language inside the filing felt clean, professional. That was the dangerous part. Paper could turn sacrifice into absence if written carefully enough. At 2:30 p.m., Denise met him at her office again. She already had a copy of the filing. Harold Whitmore had hired one of the most aggressive divorce firms in Iowa, Kessler, Vane, and Roth. Downtown office, marble lobby, $800 hourly rates. Denise tossed the packet onto her desk. "They're moving fast." Edgar sat down slowly. "Why now?" Denise looked at him for a long moment. "Because people under financial pressure isolate liabilities." The word again. Liabilities. Not husband, not family. Liability. Edgar rubbed one hand across his jaw. "She's trying to separate before something surfaces." "Probably." Denise opened another folder. And there's more. She slid several pages toward him. Temporary financial requests, asset disclosures, property recommendations. Harold's attorneys were already arguing that the house should remain primarily Caroline's because her family had contributed significantly toward its acquisition and improvement. Edgar almost laughed, not because it was funny, because the lie had become so large it barely resembled reality anymore. My mother's insurance money paid the down payment. I know. I renovated half that house myself. I know. Denise folded her arms. The problem is, they believe you won't fight hard enough to prove it. Outside the office window, traffic crawled through slushy streets beneath gray skies. Edgar stared down at the papers. The Whitmores were not just ending the marriage. They were rewriting history before the ink dried. 3 days later, Caroline moved into her parents' guest house in West Des Moines. Not temporarily, strategically. The separation immediately shifted perception around them. People assumed the wealthy daughter had escaped something unfortunate. Caroline's social media changed quietly. No photos with Edgar. No wedding anniversary pictures. No backyard renovation projects he had spent months completing. Only curated images. Wine with friends, business dinners, a caption about new chapters. Edgar saw none of it directly. Coworkers mentioned it. Even at work, the whispers started. One technician named Brian asked carefully during lunch, "You doing all right?" Edgar nodded once. "Yeah." Brian hesitated. "My wife saw something online. Said Caroline's family's telling people the marriage has been bad for years." Edgar unwrapped his sandwich slowly. People can say whatever they want, but privately the words stayed with him, because reputation moved faster than truth, especially when money guided the conversation. The following week, Harold invited Edgar to his office. Not personally, through attorneys. The meeting took place on the 16th floor of Whitmore Development Group headquarters, overlooking downtown Des Moines. Dark wood walls. Framed aerial photos of construction projects. Expensive silence. Harold sat behind a massive walnut desk while one of the Kessler attorneys organized paperwork nearby. Edgar noticed immediately that Caroline was not there. Intentional again. Harold smiled the way businessmen smiled before offering bad deals disguised as opportunities. "Edgar," he said calmly, "I'd like us to handle this cleanly." Edgar remained standing for several seconds before sitting. "What does cleanly mean?" Harold slid a folder across the desk. "Property release terms. Limited spousal support waiver. Debt allocation language, written carefully enough to sound harmless. Too harmless. You keep your truck," Harold said. "Your tools, your retirement account. Caroline keeps the house." Edgar flipped pages slowly. There it was, buried deep. Assumption of shared financial obligations associated with existing business-linked guarantees. Edgar's eyes stopped moving for half a second, then continued normally. Harold watched him carefully. The old man still believed Edgar only understood practical labor, not contracts, not wording, not traps. "What business guarantees?" Edgar asked evenly. The attorney answered before Harold could. "Minor connected obligations tied to prior family investment structures." Meaningless language, designed to blur responsibility. Edgar closed the folder. "I'll let Denise review it." Harold leaned back. "You really want to drag lawyers through this?" "You already did." A brief silence followed. Harold's expression cooled slightly. "You know, Edgar..." Caroline tried very hard. There it was again, the performance of disappointment. "As far as I can tell," Edgar replied, "she stopped trying a long time ago." Harold's jaw shifted subtly. Not anger, control recalculating itself. "Men sometimes confuse loyalty with usefulness," Harold said quietly. "Providing labor isn't the same as building a future." Edgar looked around the office. Imported desk, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows, everything designed to project power. But Edgar noticed something else too, stress. 3 unopened bank envelopes near Harold's elbow, a legal pad covered in rushed handwriting, an empty antacid bottle partially hidden behind a monitor. Whitmore Development was bleeding somewhere. Edgar could feel it. Harold spoke again. "You should think carefully before making this ugly." That sentence confirmed everything. Because innocent people rarely feared ugliness before accusations even existed. Edgar stood slowly. I'll have Denise contact your office. Then he left. No argument, no raised voice. The elevator ride down felt strangely calm. In the parking garage beneath the building, Edgar sat inside his truck for almost 10 minutes, watching concrete shadows stretch beneath fluorescent lights. The divorce was not about separation anymore. It was containment. And the Whitmores were rushing. That mattered. People made mistakes when rushing. 2 weeks later, Caroline arrived unexpectedly at the house while Edgar was replacing damaged trim along the garage door. Snow covered the lawn in uneven patches. Her white Lexus SUV pulled into the driveway around 4:20 p.m. Edgar climbed down the ladder slowly. Caroline stepped out wearing a camel-colored coat and dark sunglasses. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the driveway. Neither seemed fully familiar anymore. You're still fixing things, she said. Edgar set the drill down. Things still break. She removed the sunglasses. You could make this easier. On who Caroline exhaled sharply. Why are you acting like everything's a conspiracy? Because half the paperwork attached to their marriage already looked criminal. But Edgar did not say that. Instead, he asked, Did you know about the guarantees? Caroline looked away too quickly. Travis explained it. So yes, it wasn't supposed to become a problem. There it was. Not denial. Minimization. Edgar stepped closer. How much debt is connected to my name? Caroline folded her arms tightly. You're overreacting. That's not an answer. Harold said the company just needed flexibility for a while, Harold said. Travis explained. Always someone else steering the decisions. Edgar studied her face carefully. For the first time, he realized Caroline might not fully understand how deep the situation actually went either. That almost made him feel sorry for her. Almost. She softened her voice slightly. Edgar, just sign the settlement. Everybody moves on. Everybody. Meaning the Whitmores. Meaning the business. Meaning the financial structure, depending on his silence. Edgar picked up the drill again. I'm not signing anything I don't understand. Caroline's expression hardened immediately. There it is. What? That stubbornness, that suspicion. That's why this marriage died. No. The marriage died because truth became inconvenient inside her family. But Edgar no longer wasted energy explaining things people refused to see. Carolyn walked back toward the SUV. Before getting inside, she turned once more. My father tried to help you. Edgar looked at the house behind her. The gutters he installed, the porch light he wired, the driveway crack he sealed before winter, his mother's money inside the walls. Then he looked back at Caroline. No, he said quietly. Your father tried to use me. For the first time since the divorce began, Caroline had no immediate response. She drove away 30 seconds later. Edgar stood alone in the cold driveway while snow drifted across the neighborhood in thin white lines. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Denise. Call me immediately. We found another document tied to Prairie State Bank. Edgar stared at the message. Whatever the Whitmores had buried beneath the divorce was getting larger, and now it was surfacing faster than they could control it. Walter Foster never raised his voice unless someone was about to get hurt. Edgar learned that before he learned multiplication. When Edgar was 8 years old, he accidentally knocked over a tackle box during a fishing trip near Red Rock Lake. Hooks scattered across the dock. Edgar panicked immediately, trying to gather everything at once. Walter simply crouched beside him and said, Slow hands fix fast mistakes. It became one of those sentences Edgar carried into adulthood without realizing it. Walter had spent 31 years working as a financial compliance investigator for the state of Iowa. Most people assumed accounting investigations involved spreadsheets and office meetings. Walter knew better. Financial crimes were about personality long before numbers, greed, pressure, ego, fear. People always imagined fraud looked dramatic. Secret offshore accounts, luxury yachts, handcuffs. Most fraud actually looked ordinary. A rushed signature, a transfer nobody questioned, a husband people underestimated. 3 nights after Denise's message about the new Prairie State Bank document, Edgar drove back to Walter's house in Ankeny, carrying 2 cardboard archive boxes filled with paperwork. Snow covered the front yard in uneven layers beneath the porch light. Walter opened the garage before Edgar even parked. "Bring them inside," he said. No wasted questions. The kitchen table disappeared beneath documents within 20 minutes. Mortgage statements, transfer histories, property tax records, renovation invoices, loan disclosures, corporate filings Denise had pulled through public databases. Walter arranged everything with frightening precision, not by emotion, by timeline. Edgar watched him work while sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour earlier. Walter placed one stack to the left. Known facts. Another stack. Assumptions. Another. Things people are hiding. Edgar stared at him. "You already know there's a third stack." Walter adjusted his glasses. "There's always a third stack." The clock above the stove read 11:43 p.m. Outside wind pushed snow against the windows. Inside papers whispered softly beneath Walter's hands. Finally, Walter held up the newest document Denise had uncovered. A commercial loan extension tied to Whitmore Development Group. Edgar leaned forward slightly. "What am I looking at?" Walter tapped a line halfway down the page. Secondary guarantee authorization pending, then lower. Projected approval contingent upon existing guarantor verification. Edgar frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means somebody promised the bank another guarantor already exists." Walter looked directly at him. "And I'm willing to bet that guarantor is you." A slow coldness spread through Edgar's chest. He had expected misuse, but this felt larger, structured, deliberate. Walter continued reading. "The company's carrying too much leveraged debt." "You think they're close to collapsing?" Walter shook his head once. "No. I think they're close to exposure." That distinction mattered. Failing companies sometimes recovered. Exposed companies rarely did. Walter removed another file from the box. "Show me the renovation invoices." Edgar passed over a thick folder. Walter reviewed receipts one by one. Kitchen electrical rewiring, bathroom plumbing repair, foundation drainage correction, HVAC installation. Walter paused. "All paid from your personal account." "Mostly." "And Harold still claims the family funded improvements." Edgar nodded. Walter gave a quiet hum of acknowledgement. Then he leaned back in the chair. "Harold Whitmore's biggest weakness isn't greed. What is it he thinks status changes reality?" Edgar looked down at the papers spread across the table. That sounded exactly right. Harold believed expensive rooms made lies stronger. Walter picked up another invoice. "When men like Harold speak confidently, people stop verifying details." The kitchen fell quiet again. Finally, Edgar asked the question sitting in the back of his mind for weeks. "Did I miss signs earlier?" Walter answered immediately. "Yes. Not cruel, just honest." Edgar looked away slightly. Walter softened his tone. "But not because you're stupid." He folded his hands together. "You assumed family operated under the same rules you do." Edgar stared at the coffee ring forming near his mug. Loyalty. Trust. Shared responsibility. The Whitmores used those words differently. To them, loyalty meant silence. Trust meant access. Responsibility meant finding someone else to absorb damage. Walter stood and walked toward the sink. "When your mother got sick," he said quietly, "we almost lost the house." Edgar looked up. Walter rarely discussed those years. She hid medical bills from me for 3 months because she didn't want me stressed. He rinsed his coffee mug slowly. "Know what I learned from that? What good people hide problems to protect others." He turned back toward Edgar. "Dishonest people hide problems to protect themselves." That sentence settled heavily into the room. Because Caroline had hidden things. Travis had hidden things. Harold built entire conversations around hiding things. Walter returned to the table carrying a small metal key. He placed it beside Edgar's notebook. "Safety deposit box," he said. "Ankeny Community Bank." Edgar frowned slightly. "For what?" "For your originals. You think it's that serious?" Walter looked at him for several seconds before answering. "I think people under financial pressure stop behaving predictably." The next afternoon proved him right. At 3:27 p.m., Edgar received a voicemail from Prairie State Bank. Professional female voice. "Mr. Foster, We're contacting you regarding a verification issue tied to an outstanding commercial authorization document. Please return our call at your earliest convenience. Edgar listened twice while sitting inside his truck outside a hardware supply store. Then he called Denise immediately. She answered on the second ring. Do not call them back yet. What I want the request documented first. Edgar rubbed his forehead. You think they're trying to finalize something? I think somebody assumed you'd cooperate automatically. Her voice sharpened. Edgar listened carefully. If they're attempting to validate your identity against an existing guarantee structure, timing matters. Timing again. Everything suddenly depended on timing. That evening, Edgar stopped by the old house to collect more tools from the garage. The divorce agreement allowed temporary access during property review. The neighborhood sat quiet beneath freezing rain. Motion lights activated as he opened the garage side door. Inside smelled like sawdust and cold concrete. Half the shelving units lining the walls had been built by Edgar over the years. Every tool labeled, every extension cord wrapped correctly. Order, control. Things the Whitmores mocked until they needed something repaired. Edgar loaded a toolbox into the truck bed. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Caroline stood in the doorway wearing a wool coat and leather gloves. You didn't tell me you were coming, I texted. I didn't see it. For several seconds, neither moved. Rain tapped softly against the roof. Finally, Caroline looked toward the shelving. You taking everything? Just my tools. She crossed her arms. You always do that. What act like things belong only to you? Edgar stared at her. The shelves, the workbench, the garage heater he installed himself during their second winter in the house. Almost every object around them carried his labor somewhere inside it. But Caroline had spent years watching his work become invisible the moment it was finished. You know, she said carefully, my father thinks Denise Holloway's putting ideas in your head. Edgar almost smiled. Your father's uncomfortable because somebody's finally reading paperwork. Caroline's expression hardened. You're making this uglier than it has to be. No, Edgar said quietly. Your family already did that. Rain intensified outside. Water dripped from the edge of the garage roof. Caroline looked suddenly tired. Not guilty, just exhausted. You really think my family's trying to hurt you? Edgar held her gaze. Then he answered with the simplest truth available. I think they stopped seeing me as a person a long time ago. Something flickered briefly across her face. Not agreement, recognition. And recognition was dangerous because it meant she knew part of it was true. Her phone buzzed inside her coat pocket. She checked the screen immediately. Edgar noticed the reaction before she could hide it. Tension. She answered quickly. Hello, silence, while she listened. Then, no, not tonight. Pause. Another pause. Edgar watched her carefully. Whatever Travis said next changed her expression completely. Fear. Real fear. She turned away instinctively. I said I'll handle it. Then she hung up. Edgar set down the toolbox slowly. What happened? Caroline forced composure back onto her face too quickly. Nothing. But Edgar already knew better. Because after months of arrogance, superiority, and controlled confidence, the Whitmores were finally starting to panic. And panic meant pressure. Pressure created mistakes. Walter Foster had been waiting for that moment from the beginning. The house on Ashbury Lane looked better in photographs than it did in reality. That was one of the first things Edgar Foster noticed after Caroline moved out. Pictures hid uneven flooring near the hallway bathroom. They hid the patched drywall in the guest room ceiling after a pipe leak 3 winters earlier. They hid the fact that the back deck would have collapsed within 5 years if Edgar had not rebuilt the support beams himself. Photographs showed warm lighting. Edgar remembered the labor underneath it. One Saturday morning in December, he stood alone in the kitchen with a legal pad, a tape measure, and 3 banker's boxes full of receipts spread across the island counter. Outside, snow covered the subdivision in quiet white layers. Inside the house felt hollow, not emotionally, structurally, like something holding tension had finally snapped. Denise Holloway arrived at 8:40 a.m. carrying coffee and a portable scanner. She stepped into the kitchen and looked around slowly. This place cost them more than they admitted. Edgar glanced up. What do you mean? Denise set the coffee down. People who actually pay for things remember details. Your in-laws only describe appearances. That sounded accurate. Harold always referred to the property as the Whitmore house, even though his name had never appeared on the deed. Diane told guests they helped the young couple get started. Caroline repeated the story often enough that eventually it became accepted fact. Except facts left paper trails. And Walter Foster believed paper mattered more than memory. Edgar handed Denise the first stack of documents. These are the original down payment transfers. Denise reviewed the statements carefully. $38,000 transferred from a life insurance account previously belonging to Edgar's late mother. Another $12,000 from Edgar's personal savings. Then small supplemental transfers from Caroline. Denise looked up slowly. Harold contributed less than 10%. Mostly furniture. Denise gave a short, humorless laugh. And yet they're claiming substantial family investment. Edgar leaned against the counter. They say it, enough people believe it, not judges. She scanned another page. And not forensic accountants. That phrase stayed with Edgar. Forensic accountants. The situation kept growing larger every week. What started as hidden transfers now involved property claims, loan guarantees, possible identity misuse, and business liabilities tied to Whitmore Development Group. Every layer exposed another one beneath it. Denise walked into the living room carrying a folder of renovation invoices. She stopped beside the fireplace. You installed this gas line too, and the hardwood flooring, refinished it myself. She turned slowly, observing the house differently now, not as a marital asset, as evidence. Edgar remembered the first night he worked on the living room floors after buying the property. Caroline had fallen asleep upstairs while Edgar sanded oak planks until almost 1 o'clock a.m. because contractors quoted $14,000 they could not afford at the time. He worked section by section for 2 weeks after regular shifts, hands blistered, knees swollen. Worth it, he thought back then. Because building something together mattered. Now Denise photographed the same flooring for court documentation. Funny how quickly sacrifice became paperwork. At noon, Walter arrived carrying another archive box. He removed his coat near the door and immediately noticed the stacks covering the kitchen. Good, he said simply, not emotional, not sympathetic, focused. Walter always became calmer when situations turned serious. He placed another folder beside Denise. County permit records. Edgar frowned. You pulled permits. Walter nodded. Every renovation tied to your contractor number. Denise opened the folder. Inside sat permit applications listing Edgar as responsible installer for electrical HVAC plumbing and structural work completed over 4 years. Walter adjusted his glasses. Hard to argue someone didn't contribute to a property when the county inspection office has his name on half the improvements. Edgar looked at his father. You thought of this already? Walter's expression barely changed. I thought of it the day Harold Whitmore first called you lucky for marrying Caroline. That surprised Edgar slightly. Walter rarely discussed personal feelings openly, but Edgar suddenly remembered something from years earlier. After one Christmas dinner at the Whitmores, Walter had stood beside Edgar's truck in freezing weather before driving home. Careful with people who mistake kindness for dependence, Walter had said quietly. At the time, Edgar thought he meant social arrogance. Now he understood his father had noticed something deeper much earlier. Denise continued sorting documents. Then she paused at one invoice. This one's strange. Edgar stepped closer. Kitchen cabinet installation. Original amount $11,400. Then a revised copy submitted later through Whitmore Development Reimbursement Records showing $34,800. Edgar stared at the page. What the hell? Walter leaned in beside him. Walter leaned in. Inflated reimbursement reporting. Denise's jaw tightened. Or expense padding. Edgar felt cold settle behind his ribs. They altered invoices, Walter answered first. Looks that way. Denise scanned the document again. Do you know how serious this becomes if they used falsified renovation values during financing reviews? Edgar shook his head slowly. No. Walter did. Very serious. The room fell quiet. Outside, a snowplow passed slowly down Ashbury Lane. Inside, the house suddenly felt less like a home and more like a crime scene nobody had examined yet. At 2:15 p.m., Edgar's phone buzzed. Caroline calling. He looked at Denise. She nodded once. Speaker. Edgar answered. Yeah. Caroline sounded tense immediately. Why are lawyers requesting permit records? Edgar remained calm. Probably because permits exist. A silence. Then Harold's furious. About what specifically? You know exactly what. No, Edgar said evenly. I really don't. Another pause. In the background he heard muffled voices. One of them sounded like Travis. Caroline lowered her voice. This is getting out of control. Edgar stared across the kitchen at the papers spread beneath Walter's hands. No, he said quietly. I think it's finally becoming accurate. She exhaled sharply. You're turning everything into a legal war. No, Caroline. Your family attached my name to financial documents without telling me. That's not what happened. Then explain what happened. Silence again. Not because she lacked words, because every explanation required stepping near the truth. Finally, she said, Travis said it was temporary. Edgar closed his eyes briefly. Still that phrase, temporary, as if fraud became harmless when given an expiration date. You signed things too, he asked. No, too fast. Walter looked up immediately from the table. He heard it too, Caroline continued quickly. I mean, not officially. Edgar's voice stayed calm. What does that mean? Another silence. Then I have to go. She hung up. Walter leaned back slowly. She knows more than she admits. Edgar stared at the dark phone screen. Maybe. No, Walter corrected. Definitely. Denise gathered several papers into separate folders. They're getting nervous now. Edgar looked around the house again. The staircase he refinished. The recessed lights he installed. The dining room crown molding he measured 3 times before cutting because Caroline wanted it perfect for Thanksgiving photos. Years of work sat around him physically. Yet Harold Whitmore still described Edgar as a man who didn't own a nail in that house. That sentence replayed in Edgar's mind often now. Not because it hurt, because it revealed how the Whitmores saw labor. Invisible once completed, useful until inconvenient, disposable afterward. Walter closed another folder carefully. They expected you to walk away quietly. Edgar nodded. Most people would. Walter looked directly at him. But most people don't document everything. Late that afternoon, Denise prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, she turned back toward Edgar. One more thing. What? They're pushing hard for final divorce signatures next month. Edgar folded his arms. I know, I think you should sign. The room went still. Even Walter looked up sharply. Edgar frowned. You want me to finalize this? Denise nodded slowly. Yes. Why? Because right now they still believe the divorce protects them. Walter understood immediately. Edgar saw it in his face. If the Whitmores believed Edgar emotionally defeated, financially cornered, and eager to escape conflict, they would relax. And relaxed people expose themselves. Walter gave a slow, approving nod. Let them celebrate too early. Denise picked up her coat. They already think you lost. Edgar looked around the house one more time. The home built partly with his mother's money, maintained by his hands, quietly claimed by other people. Then he asked the only question that mattered. What happens if they realize I'm not backing down? Walter answered before Denise could. Then they'll make mistakes faster. The snow outside had stopped by evening, but the sky over Des Moines still looked heavy enough to collapse. And somewhere inside Whitmore Development Group pressure was building. Behind walls Edgar had finally learned how to see through. The email arrived on a Tuesday night at 11:08 p.m. Edgar Foster had just finished replacing a failed blower motor inside an office complex near Court Avenue. Snowmelt soaked the cuffs of his jeans. His shoulders ached from 12 straight hours of work. He sat inside his truck in the parking garage heater, running low when his phone vibrated. From Caroline Whitmore Foster, subject closure dinner. Dinner. Edgar stared at the screen for several seconds before opening it. The message was short. Now that everything is finalized, my family wanted to host a small dinner Thursday night at Blackwood Chop House. We thought it would be healthier for everyone to end things peacefully. Hope you'll come. Healthy. Peacefully. Edgar leaned back against the seat slowly. Outside the windshield, fluorescent lights reflected off wet concrete and puddled slush. Nothing about the email felt peaceful. It felt staged, a final public performance where the Whitmores could display survival after escaping Edgar Foster. He already knew how the night would look. Harold giving speeches, Diane pretending sadness while enjoying every second, Travis recording jokes for private group chats, Caroline sitting elegantly at the center of it all, composed enough to appear mature, and Edgar placed somewhere at the edge of the room, like an embarrassing contractor waiting for final payment. His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Denise. Did they invite you? Edgar typed back immediately. Yes. 3 dots appeared. Then good. Go. Edgar frowned. Why? Because people reveal the most when they think the story is over. Edgar stared at the response while snow slid slowly down the parking ramp entrance. For months now, every conversation with Denise and Walter carried the same lesson beneath it. Patience created visibility. Emotional people interrupted their enemies. Calm people watched them expose themselves. Edgar started the truck. At 11:42 p.m., he pulled into Walter Foster's driveway in Ankeny. Walter opened the front door wearing a gray thermal shirt and reading glasses. You look tired. Edgar held up the phone. I got invited to a celebration. Walter read the email once, then handed the phone back. You going? Edgar stepped inside. The house smelled like coffee and cedarwood again. I think they want to humiliate me. Walter shut the door quietly. Yes. Straight answer, no comfort, no false reassurance. Walter walked toward the kitchen. Sit down. Edgar removed his jacket and sat at the table while Walter poured 2 cups of coffee. Steam curled upward beneath the yellow kitchen light. For a while, neither spoke. Then Walter asked, What scares you about going? Edgar considered the question carefully. Not anger, not confrontation. Something else. They already decided who I am, he said quietly. Walter nodded once. Most people do that early. I'm tired of it. Walter sat across from him. Good. Edgar looked up slightly. You know why Walter wrapped both hands around the coffee mug? Because tired men stop performing. The clock above the stove ticked softly. Walter continued. Harold Whitmore's entire life is performance, wealth, control, reputation. Men like that believe public perception is reality. Edgar thought about the dinners, the speeches, the country club conversations designed to sound effortless. Walter leaned forward slightly. So let him perform. And then what Walter's expression hardened just enough. Then let paper answer him. The following morning, Edgar met Denise Holloway at her office again. This time, she already had folders prepared across the conference table. Color-coded tabs. Bank records. Property documents. Corporate filings. Prairie State Bank correspondence. Denise handed Edgar a legal envelope. What's this preliminary financial summary? Edgar opened it slowly. Inside sat a timeline. Every suspicious transfer, every altered invoice. Every questionable authorization tied to Whitmore development. Months of careful assembly. Edgar stared at the pages. This is enough already. Denise shook her head. No. Then what are we waiting for? She looked directly at him. The point where they stop being cautious. Edgar sat back slowly. The dinner. Yes, Denise folded her arms. Right now they still think this is a divorce, a social conflict, a family disagreement. She tapped the file lightly. I want them relaxed before this becomes financial exposure. That word again. Exposure. Edgar noticed how neither Denise nor Walter spoke emotionally about revenge. They spoke structurally, strategically, like engineers discussing pressure inside damaged steel. Denise slid another folder across the table. Bring this Thursday. Edgar opened it. Inside sat copies of specific property records and reimbursement discrepancies. Not everything, just enough. You want me to confront them? No. Then why bring it? Because sometimes visible confidence changes how people behave. Edgar looked at her carefully. You think they'll panic if they realize I know more than they expected? I think Travis especially will. That afternoon, Edgar returned to the apartment he rented near East Village. 700 square feet, thin walls, radiator heat that clicked loudly at night. The place still smelled faintly of fresh paint because the previous tenant had moved out only weeks before he signed the lease. Most of Edgar's belongings remained boxed near the living room wall. He unpacked slowly these days, like some part of him still expected life to reset backward. The apartment lacked warmth, but it had something the Whitmore house never truly gave him: quiet without judgment. Nobody there cared what truck he drove. Nobody corrected his vocabulary at dinner. Nobody introduced him like a temporary inconvenience. Edgar placed Denise's folder carefully inside a worn leather messenger bag. Then he stood at the small kitchen counter eating reheated chili while snow drifted outside the window. His phone buzzed again. Travis Whitmore. Edgar answered after the second ring. Well, Travis said immediately, look at you. Heard you lawyered up pretty aggressively. Edgar remained calm. I hired representation. Travis laughed softly. Sounds expensive for an HVAC guy. Same tone, same arrogance, even now. Edgar stirred the chili slowly. What do you want, Travis? Honestly, I'm trying to help you. That almost made Edgar smile. Almost. You should come Thursday, Travis continued. Clean slate. Everybody moves on. Funny, Edgar said quietly. That's exactly what Caroline called it. Because it is. In the background, Edgar heard bar noise, glasses, music. Travis was drinking somewhere. Then Travis lowered his voice slightly. You know Harold's prepared to be generous if you stop making things complicated. There it is. What? The real conversation. Silence. Then Travis chuckled again. Man, you always think people are against you. Edgar looked out the apartment window toward snow-covered rooftops. No, he replied. I just started paying attention. The line went quiet for a second too long. Then Travis recovered. Look, Thursday night. No lawyers, no drama. We eat, drink, move on. Edgar said nothing. Travis filled the silence again. You know Caroline's embarrassed by all this, right? That landed differently, not because it hurt, because Edgar realized something. The Whitmores still believed shame controlled him. They assumed humiliation would make him retreat, apologize, disappear quietly. They still did not understand the difference between pride and dignity. Edgar ended the call 3 minutes later. At 6:15 p.m. the next evening, Walter arrived at Edgar's apartment carrying a garment bag. What's that? Walter handed it over. My old suit. Edgar frowned slightly. You serious? You need something darker than that brown jacket you own. Edgar opened the bag. Dark charcoal wool, old-fashioned cut, immaculately maintained. He remembered Walter wearing it at his mother's funeral. You kept this? Walter shrugged. Still fits you better than me. For a moment, Edgar simply stared at the suit quietly. Then Walter spoke again. Harold's expecting anger tomorrow. Edgar nodded. Travis is expecting embarrassment. Another nod. Walter's eyes sharpened slightly. So give them neither. The next night arrived colder than expected. Wind swept across downtown Des Moines hard enough to rattle traffic lights. At 6:40 p.m., Edgar stood alone inside his apartment, fastening the buttons on Walter's charcoal suit jacket. It fit almost perfectly. The leather messenger bag sat on the kitchen counter beside Denise's folder. Evidence. Timeline. Truth compressed into paper. Edgar looked at himself once in the mirror. Not wealthy, not polished like Harold Whitmore, but steady. And for the first time in months, completely awake. His phone buzzed one final time before he left. A message from Denise. Remember, tonight isn't about revenge. It's about visibility. Edgar locked the apartment door behind him. Then he walked toward the parking lot where his old silver Ford waited beneath falling snow. Across town, the Whitmores were preparing a celebration. What they did not understand yet was simple. They had invited the only person in the room who already knew how the night would end. Harold Whitmore stood beneath the amber chandelier with a bourbon glass in one hand and complete confidence in the other. That was the first thing Edgar Foster noticed after Walter sat down beside him at Blackwood Chop House. Harold still believed he controlled the room. The private dining space glowed with soft gold lighting reflected off polished wood and crystal glasses. Waiters moved carefully between tables carrying trays of steak and wine while quiet jazz drifted through hidden speakers. To anyone walking past the frosted glass walls outside, the night looked elegant, civilized, successful. Exactly the image Harold Whitmore spent his life manufacturing. Walter sat silently beside Edgar, one hand resting lightly atop the old leather briefcase. He had not touched the coffee in front of him, had not greeted anyone else, had not smiled once. Across the room, Travis Whitmore shifted uneasily near the bar. Edgar noticed it immediately. Travis kept glancing toward the briefcase, toward Walter, toward Edgar. Tiny movements, but nervous ones. Harold either missed them or ignored them. Now Harold announced, raising his glass slightly higher. "Where were we?" A few guests laughed politely. Diane straightened in her chair beside him, pearl necklace resting neatly against her black dress. Caroline sat to Harold's right, fingers wrapped tightly around a wine stem. Edgar noticed her knuckles had turned pale. "Interesting." Harold smiled broadly. "As I was saying, tonight isn't about bitterness." More polite laughter. "It's about new beginnings." Travis lifted his phone again from near the bar. "Recording. Always recording." Harold turned slightly toward Caroline. "My daughter spent too long carrying a relationship that limited her." Edgar heard forks stop moving around the room. People loved humiliation when served with steak and alcohol. Harold continued smoothly. "Some men are comfortable surviving. Others are meant to build." There it was again. The Whitmore definition of worth. Money first, appearance second, human character somewhere far below both. Harold took a sip of bourbon. "Caroline deserves a future surrounded by ambition." Diane nodded approvingly. A woman near the back murmured something supportive. Caroline forced a restrained smile. Edgar watched her carefully. Not happy. Not exactly. Just committed to the performance now that it had begun. Harold looked directly at Edgar. "And despite everything, we genuinely wish you well." The sentence landed with the cold precision of an insult practiced beforehand. Edgar lifted his water glass calmly. "Appreciate it." No anger, no visible embarrassment. That unsettled several people more than shouting would have. Travis stepped closer from the bar. "Come on, Edgar," he said loudly. "You gotta admit Caroline was carrying the team a little." Several guests laughed harder this time. Edgar looked at him quietly. Travis smiled wider under the attention. What Travis said. Too soon. Walter finally moved slightly beside Edgar. Not much, just enough to place both hands neatly atop the leather briefcase. Travis noticed, and immediately stopped smiling as naturally. "Interesting again." Harold pressed forward before momentum faded. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I always believed marriage required equals." Edgar remained silent. Harold smiled into the room. "There's nothing wrong with tradesmen. America needs hard-working men." The way wealthy people said hard-working men often sounded identical to how they described landscaping equipment. Useful, replaceable. Harold continued. "But eventually reality matters. Lifestyle matters. Compatibility matters." Edgar thought about the mortgage payments he made while Harold vacationed in Scottsdale, about replacing pipes beneath the Whitmore guest house during Christmas break, about overtime shifts spent paying down Caroline's debts. Reality had mattered then, just not publicly. A waiter approached Edgar carefully. "Would you like another water, sir?" Before Edgar answered, Travis laughed. "Maybe bring him the cheapest thing on the menu." More laughter. Edgar noticed Melissa Caroline's old college friend look away uncomfortably. At least one person in the room still possessed a functioning conscience. Edgar set his glass down gently. Then he reached beside his chair and placed Denise's folder on the table. The movement was small, quiet, but Travis noticed instantly. So did Harold. So Harold said carefully, "You brought paperwork to dinner." Edgar met his eyes calmly. "You brought lawyers to my divorce." A faint shift passed through the room, not fear yet, but discomfort. Harold smiled again, though tighter now. Legal processes protect everyone. Sometimes. Walter still said nothing. That silence had started changing the room already. People kept looking toward him without understanding why. It was not intimidation exactly. It was composure. Walter looked like a man attending a meeting whose outcome he already knew. Harold cleared his throat lightly. Well, he said, forcing warmth back into his tone, no reason to dwell on unpleasantness. He lifted the bourbon glass again. To Caroline. Several guests echoed the toast. To Caroline. To freedom. To fresh starts. Glasses clinked. Travis raised his phone higher to capture the moment. Then Diane added softly, and to leaving behind relationships that hold us back. That line drew approving murmurs around the tables. Edgar watched Caroline carefully after that. She still would not fully meet his eyes. Not because she felt innocent, because innocence usually looked directly at people. Walter finally picked up his coffee cup. One sip, nothing more. Harold sat back down slowly, satisfied the room remained under his control. Then Travis decided to push harder. Big mistake. He walked toward Edgar's table carrying a whiskey glass, confidence exaggerated by alcohol. You know what always amazed me, Travis said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Edgar said nothing. That Caroline stayed patient as long as she did. A few people shifted awkwardly. Even Harold glanced toward Travis now, but Travis kept going. Man, you're a nice enough guy, Edgar. But honestly, he shrugged dramatically, you were never really Whitmore material. Silence. The room waited, probably expecting Edgar to explode. Instead, Edgar asked quietly, what exactly does Whitmore material mean? Travis smirked. You know, success. Edgar tilted his head slightly. You mean debt? The smile disappeared from Travis's face instantly. Tiny moment, easy to miss. But not for Walter, not for Edgar, not for Harold either. Harold set his bourbon glass down harder than intended. That's enough, he said sharply. Too sharp. Guests noticed. Travis recovered quickly. I'm just saying some people belong in different worlds. Edgar nodded once. Maybe. Then he opened the folder slowly. Not dramatically. Just enough for visible papers to appear beneath the table light. Bank statements, transfer records, property invoices. Nothing fully exposed yet. But enough. Travis stopped moving entirely. Harold's expression froze for half a second before correcting itself. Caroline looked directly at the folder, then at Edgar. For the first time all night, actual uncertainty appeared in her face. Edgar closed the folder again without removing a single page. The message had already landed. I know. Across the room, conversations weakened into scattered murmurs. People sensed tension now without understanding its shape. Harold forced a laugh. Well, he said loudly, I certainly hope nobody plans on turning dinner into an audit. Walter Foster finally spoke. Just one sentence. Depends what the paperwork says. The room went completely still. Walter's voice carried no emotion, which somehow made it worse. Travis swallowed visibly. Diane looked toward Harold. Caroline lowered her wine glass slowly onto the tablecloth. Edgar remained calm beside his father. Outside the restaurant windows, snow moved sideways through downtown Des Moines beneath yellow streetlights. Inside, the atmosphere had changed completely. Not explosive, compressed, like pressure building inside steel pipes before rupture. Harold smiled again, but this time Edgar saw effort behind it. Well, Harold said carefully, we're all family here. Walter looked directly at him. No, he replied quietly. That's the problem. Nobody spoke after that. Not immediately. The jazz music continued softly overhead. A waiter carrying a tray paused uncertainly near the kitchen doors. Travis lowered his phone completely for the first time all evening, and Edgar realized something important. The Whitmores had spent years controlling rooms through money confidence and humiliation. But none of those things worked well once people sensed documentation, because insults disappeared into air, paper stayed. Then the private dining room doors opened again, and this time Denise Holloway walked in beside a man Edgar had never seen before. Dark overcoat, state identification badge clipped near his belt. Serious expression. Harold Whitmore's face lost color immediately. The man beside Denise Holloway did not look like law enforcement in the way movies taught people to expect. No uniform, no visible weapon, no dramatic entrance, just a dark wool coat damp from snow-polished shoes and a leather identification wallet clipped near his belt. Professional. Controlled. Dangerous in the quiet way paperwork became dangerous. The room at Blackwood Chop House fell almost completely silent as Denise stepped forward. Harold Whitmore stood slowly. "What is this?" His voice remained steady, but Edgar noticed something important immediately. Harold did not sound confused. He sounded interrupted. Denise removed black gloves carefully before answering. "Good evening, Harold." The man beside her scanned the room once, not nervous, not emotional, assessing. Then he looked directly toward Edgar and Walter. Walter gave a small nod. The man returned it. Connection confirmed. Interesting. Harold forced a smile for the guests watching. If this is about legal scheduling, perhaps another time would be more appropriate. Denise ignored the performance completely. "This is Daniel Reeves," she said calmly, "Financial Investigations Liaison working with the Iowa Attorney General's office." That sentence changed the air inside the room. Not loudly, instantly. Travis Whitmore lowered his whiskey glass too fast and splashed liquor onto his sleeve. Diane's posture stiffened. Caroline stopped breathing for half a second. Only Walter remained unchanged. Daniel Reeves stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Whitmore." Harold recovered quickly. There must be some misunderstanding. Daniel did not answer that. People who handled financial investigations rarely rushed to reassure anyone. Denise placed a sealed envelope onto the nearest table, then another, and another, not theatrically, methodically. Each envelope carried official markings: Prairie State Bank, Document Preservation Notice, Preliminary Financial Review Request. Travis stared at them like they might explode. Harold's smile disappeared completely now. One guest near the back quietly set down her wine glass. Another couple exchanged uncomfortable looks. The party no longer felt elegant. It felt contaminated. Harold straightened his jacket. "I think this conversation should happen privately," Daniel answered evenly. "It will. Eventually." Then he looked around the room. "But tonight's timing wasn't chosen by us. That landed harder than accusation would have, because everybody understood what he meant. The Whitmores chose tonight. They built the stage themselves." Travis stepped forward aggressively now. "This is ridiculous." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Daniel finally looked directly at him. "Travis Whitmore." "Yeah. We'll need to speak with you before the evening ends." Travis glanced instinctively toward Harold. That movement alone told Edgar almost everything. Harold moved immediately to regain control. "My attorney will contact Denise," interrupted him for the first time. "Your attorney's already received notice requests this afternoon." Harold stopped speaking. Interesting again. Edgar sat quietly beside Walter while the room shifted around them like unstable flooring. A waiter near the kitchen doorway stood frozen, holding a tray of unfinished drinks. Jazz music still floated softly overhead, absurdly calm compared to the tension now filling the room. Diane forced herself to speak. "There has to be some mistake." Walter finally picked up his coffee again. "No," he said quietly. "There were several. Nobody responded to him. Mostly because nobody could." Daniel opened a slim folder in his hands. "Whitmore Development Group is currently connected to multiple irregular financial transfers under preliminary review." Harold's jaw tightened. "Preliminary." "Yes," Daniel agreed calmly. "Which is why cooperation matters." Travis stepped closer now, anger replacing panic, because anger felt easier. "You can't walk into a private dinner and accuse people of crimes." Daniel looked at him without blinking. "I didn't accuse anyone of anything. That was true. And somehow more frightening." Denise moved toward Edgar's table. She placed one hand lightly atop the folder Edgar brought earlier. Then she addressed Harold directly. "The issue right now is documentation." Harold laughed once. Forced. Thin. Documentation from him. The room shifted again. Because even now, even standing inches from formal investigation notices, Harold Whitmore still spoke about Edgar like a disposable employee. Not a man. Not an equal. Useful labor. Limited intellect. Walter looked at Harold for several seconds before speaking. "That assumption may end up costing you everything." Silence followed. Deep silence. Caroline finally stood from her chair. "Can we please stop this?" Everyone looked toward her. For the first time all night, she appeared genuinely shaken, not embarrassed socially, afraid. She turned toward Denise. You're escalating something that could have stayed private. Denise studied her carefully. Mrs. Foster, financial irregularities tied to identity misuse and unauthorized guarantees rarely remain private forever. Identity misuse. Several guests visibly reacted to those words. One man near the back quietly reached for his coat. People tolerated marital drama. Possible fraud was different. Harold noticed guests beginning to withdraw emotionally from the room. That frightened him more than legal language. Reputation mattered first. Always. He pointed toward Edgar suddenly. You planned this. Edgar met his eyes calmly. No, he said. You invited me. The sentence hit harder than shouting, because it was true. Harold looked around the room again, realizing too late that public humiliation worked both ways once facts entered the conversation. Daniel removed several papers from his folder. These are not arrest documents, he clarified evenly. At this stage, we are preserving records and requesting cooperation. Diane grabbed Harold's arm. Harold, quietly, warning him, because she saw it too now. The room was no longer theirs. Travis tried one final burst of confidence. This is all because of some paperwork confusion. Daniel looked directly at him. Mr. Whitmore, do you normally request third-party guarantee authorizations using altered verification structures? Travis froze completely. Not metaphorically. Actually, froze. Edgar noticed Caroline look toward her brother instantly, then toward Harold, then toward the floor. A chain reaction. One person realizing another person knew more than expected. Harold stepped forward. My son doesn't handle legal authorizations alone. Bad answer. Too fast. Daniel wrote something briefly inside the folder. Harold realized his mistake immediately. Walter noticed too. Pressure created leaks, exactly as predicted. Denise opened Edgar's folder at last, slowly. Inside sat copies of altered invoices, transfer timelines, and account records. Not all of them, just enough. Harold stared at the pages. His face lost color gradually now, instead of all at once, because he recognized them. Real documents always frightened dishonest people more than accusations did. You went through our financials, Harold asked quietly. Edgar answered simply. You used my name. Another silence. This one heavier. Across the room, Melissa quietly picked up her purse. Another couple stood near the back, pretending they had an early morning commitment. The social collapse had begun. No yelling, no dramatic scene, just distance. People separating themselves from risk. Daniel closed his folder carefully. Mr. Whitmore, effective, immediately relevant financial records tied to Prairie State Bank authorizations and Whitmore development reimbursements must be preserved intact. Harold tried again. You're treating us like criminals, Daniel answered with almost surgical calm. No, I'm treating this like documentation. That sentence seemed to hit harder than anything else all evening, because the Whitmores survived through narrative control. Documentation ignored narratives. Travis suddenly pulled out his phone, probably instinct, probably panic. Daniel noticed immediately. Please don't delete anything. Travis looked up sharply. I wasn't good. Travis lowered the phone slowly. Edgar watched the room carefully. Hours earlier, these same people laughed while Harold mocked him for being maintenance class. Now nobody laughed at all. Interesting how quickly social gravity shifted once evidence entered the room. Caroline moved toward Edgar finally, not close enough to touch him, just close enough to lower her voice. You knew. Edgar looked at her calmly. Yes. How long, he considered answering dishonestly. Didn't. Long enough. Her eyes flickered toward Walter, then toward the folder, then toward Daniel Reeves. Everything around her was changing shape too fast. For the first time since the divorce began, Caroline understood something terrifying. Edgar had never been lost, only quiet. And quiet men were dangerous when everybody else confused silence with blindness. Daniel checked his watch once, then addressed Harold again. Our office will follow up formally tomorrow morning. Harold said nothing, couldn't, because every possible response now sounded guilty. Denise gathered several documents back into Edgar's folder. Walter finally stood from his chair beside his son, slowly, calmly. The old leather briefcase remained unopened, That bothered Harold more than anything else, because if this was already happening before Walter even opened the case, nobody touched the dessert course. The chocolate cake sat untouched beneath warm restaurant lighting while the room inside Blackwood Chop House slowly transformed from celebration into containment. Guests no longer spoke above murmurs. Chairs shifted quietly. Phones disappeared into purses and jacket pockets. People who arrived expecting entertainment now wanted distance. Edgar Foster remained seated beside Walter while Denise Holloway reorganized documents across the table with calm precision. No rushing, no theatrical confrontation. That calmness unsettled the Whitmores more than outrage ever could, because anger could be dismissed as emotion. Paper could not. Daniel Reeves stood near the end of the table, reviewing notes inside a slim black folder. Harold Whitmore finally spoke again after nearly 2 minutes of silence. "You're making assumptions based on incomplete information." His voice had changed, still controlled, but thinner now. Less certainty holding it together. Denise looked up from the paperwork. "Then complete the information." Harold's jaw tightened. Travis shifted beside the bar again, restless energy moving through him like static electricity. Edgar noticed his right leg bouncing slightly, panic leaking through muscle memory. Diane tried to recover some form of social control. "This has become inappropriate," she said sharply. "There are guests here," Walter answered before anyone else could. "You invited witnesses." Another silence. The old man's timing remained surgical. Harold turned toward Edgar directly now. "What exactly do you think you've uncovered?" Interesting wording. Not "what happened?" Not "what are these documents?" But "what do you think?" Meaning, Harold already knew the material existed. Edgar folded his hands calmly atop the table. "I think my identity was tied to debt structures without my consent." Harold laughed once, too quickly. "Debt structures," he repeated. "You sound like a lawyer now." "No," Edgar said quietly. "Sound like somebody reading paperwork." A few guests looked away immediately, because the sentence carried truth sharp enough to embarrass anyone sitting nearby. Denise opened another folder. Prairie State Bank flagged irregular guarantor verification patterns connected to Whitmore Development approximately 6 weeks ago. Daniel nodded once in confirmation. Harold's face remained still now, too still. Edgar had worked around enough damaged machinery to recognize controlled pressure. The most dangerous systems were often quietest before rupture. Travis stepped forward abruptly. "This is insane." Daniel looked toward him. "Is it?" "Yes." "Then explain the authorization request tied to Edgar Foster's identity." Travis opened his mouth. Stopped. Looked toward Harold. Bad move again. Daniel noticed every time Travis searched another person's face before answering. Guilty people often checked hierarchy before truth. Harold stepped in immediately. "My son handles administrative coordination. He's not responsible for corporate legal structures." Travis looked stunned for half a second. Edgar noticed. So did Denise. Interesting. Harold had just started separating himself from Travis publicly. Pressure creating fractures. Denise slid a photocopied document across the table. "Then perhaps you can explain this." Harold picked it up. Edgar already knew which one it was. The altered reimbursement invoice for the Ashbury Lane renovations. Kitchen cabinetry inflated by over $20,000. Harold read silently, then placed the paper down carefully. "That's an accounting discrepancy." Denise's expression did not move. "Submitted to a bank during lending review. Still not fraud." Daniel finally spoke again. "Not all fraud begins as fraud." "Mr. Whitmore." That sentence changed something, because it acknowledged escalation, small dishonesties becoming structural ones. Travis rubbed both hands across his face now, sweating despite the cold room. One of the restaurant managers quietly entered through the side door and whispered something to a waiter. Edgar noticed several staff members avoiding eye contact with the Whitmores now. Reputation traveled fast in expensive places. Caroline still stood near the table unmoving. Edgar watched her carefully. She looked less angry now than overwhelmed, like somebody slowly realizing they boarded the wrong plane halfway through the flight. Finally, she looked toward Edgar again. You really documented all of this? Edgar answered honestly. Yes. Why? The question sounded genuine. That surprised him slightly. Why? As if protecting himself required explanation. Edgar held her gaze, because things stopped making sense. Caroline lowered her eyes briefly. For years, she probably believed Edgar simply absorbed humiliation without noticing patterns beneath it. Now she understood he noticed almost everything. He just rarely announced it. Denise continued laying out documents, transfer summaries, authorization inconsistencies, timeline records. Walter assembled. Daniel reviewed each one carefully while making notes. No accusations yet. That frightened Harold more. Formal accusations could be fought publicly. Careful investigation meant uncertainty. And uncertainty destroyed people like Harold Whitmore faster than shame did. Diane suddenly pointed toward Edgar. You're enjoying this. Edgar looked at her. No. That answer startled her. Because it was true. Edgar did not feel triumphant. Mostly tired. Years tired. Tired of being spoken about like a temporary inconvenience. Tired of his labor becoming invisible once completed. Tired of wealthy people treating dignity like something purchased instead of practiced. Walter finally opened the old leather briefcase. The sound alone pulled every eye toward him. Slow metal clasps, soft leather movement. Inside sat organized folders thicker than the ones Denise brought. Harold visibly lost color. Walter removed the first file carefully. County records, he said calmly. Then another. Original permit applications. Another. Property improvement payment logs. He placed each folder onto the table one at a time. No drama, just accumulation. Walter looked toward Harold. You said my son didn't own a nail in that house. Harold said nothing. Walter opened the first folder. Inside sat years of permit approvals listing Edgar Foster as responsible contractor or installer for major repairs and renovations throughout Ashbury Lane. HVAC systems. Electrical rewiring, structural decking, plumbing upgrades. Walter tapped the stack lightly. Turns out he owned quite a few. Nobody laughed. Travis looked physically ill now. Edgar noticed his breathing becoming shallow. Daniel noticed too. Mr. Whitmore. Daniel said evenly, I strongly recommend retaining all electronic communications related to financing discussions. Travis snapped defensively. I know my rights. Yes, Daniel replied calmly. That's why I'm advising preservation instead of deletion. Silence again. Heavy silence. Because everybody in the room understood the implication. They expected destruction of evidence now. Caroline sat down slowly beside the table, not gracefully, almost weakly. She looked toward Harold. Dad. Harold kept staring at the documents. For the first time in years, Edgar saw the old man without social armor. Not confident, calculating desperately, trying to identify escape routes. Harold looked toward Walter. You've been planning this. Walter shook his head once. No. Then he pointed lightly toward Edgar. He prepared for it. Important distinction. Planning revenge implied malice. Preparing for truth implied survival. Harold rubbed one hand across his mouth. This could destroy the company. Daniel closed another folder. That depends on the company. The room felt colder now despite the restaurant heating. Several guests quietly left without saying goodbye. Melissa paused briefly near Edgar's chair before leaving. I'm sorry, she whispered softly. Not for tonight. For years. Edgar gave a small nod. Nothing else needed saying. Across the room, Travis suddenly spoke again. This whole thing started because Edgar couldn't handle the divorce. Wrong move. Denise answered immediately. No. It started when someone attached his identity to financial exposure without disclosure. Direct, precise, irrefutable. Travis looked toward Caroline again. She did not defend him this time. That frightened him more than Daniel Reeves. Edgar watched the family carefully now. The Whitmores always appeared unified during power. Now stress separated them into individuals. Harold protecting himself. Travis panicking. Diane preserving image. Caroline finally questioning reality. Walter leaned back slightly beside Edgar. Then he spoke quietly enough that only nearby people heard. Truth doesn't care who paid for dinner. Harold closed his eyes briefly. Just once. Tiny crack. But real. Daniel checked his watch again. Formal interviews will begin tomorrow morning. Harold looked up sharply. With who, Daniel met his eyes evenly. That depends who cooperates first. Another fracture appeared instantly across the room, because suddenly the Whitmores understood something worse than investigation. They understood isolation. And Edgar realized the family that spent years making him feel small was now quietly terrified of one another. What else was still inside it? The room emptied in stages, not dramatically, quietly, which somehow made it more humiliating for the Whitmores. People who once leaned forward eagerly during Harold Whitmore's stories now avoided eye contact while gathering coats and purses. Chairs scraped softly across polished flooring. Half-finished wine glasses remained abandoned beside untouched desserts. Nobody wanted to be connected to the table anymore. At 9:17 p.m., the first couple left without saying goodbye. 5 minutes later, two more guests followed. By 9:30, nearly half the room was gone. The jazz music overhead continued anyway, soft and indifferent. Edgar Foster sat beside Walter, watching the collapse happen slowly. Not enjoying it, observing it. Harold remained standing near the center of the room like a man refusing to acknowledge structural failure inside a building already leaning sideways. Diane kept attempting small social recoveries. This is all being exaggerated. People misunderstand financial paperwork all the time. Harold's company has operated for decades, but nobody truly listened anymore, because confidence without control sounded desperate. Travis paced near the bar with his phone pressed against his ear. Edgar overheard fragments. No, don't send anything yet. I said stop emailing. Just wait until tomorrow. Delete panic. Exactly what Daniel Reeves predicted. Daniel himself remained near the end of the dining room, calmly reviewing notes while Denise organized folders beside him. No threats. No shouting. The Whitmores kept waiting for emotional conflict. Instead, they received procedure. Procedure frightened wealthy people more, especially wealthy people used to talking their way out of consequences. Caroline still sat near the center table, shoulders slightly lowered, now staring at the document spread across the linen cloth. Edgar noticed she had not touched her wine in almost 20 minutes. Interesting. Earlier in the evening, she drank steadily, back when this was still supposed to be a celebration. Walter leaned slightly toward Edgar. Notice something. Edgar kept his eyes forward. What nobody's laughing anymore. Simple sentence. Heavy truth. For years, the Whitmores built power socially. Jokes, status, humiliation disguised as sophistication. Now none of it worked because evidence had entered the room. Evidence killed performance. Harold finally moved toward Edgar's table again. His posture remained controlled, but the effort behind it showed now. Can we speak privately? Edgar looked at him calmly. We're speaking already. Harold's jaw flexed slightly. This doesn't need an audience. Walter answered before Edgar could. Funny timing for that realization. Harold ignored him. He looked directly at Edgar. You're smarter than this. That almost made Edgar laugh. Not because the sentence was insulting, because it revealed Harold still fundamentally misunderstood him. Harold believed intelligence existed only inside negotiation rooms and financial meetings. He still could not comprehend patience as strategy. Edgar folded his hands together. What exactly am I smarter than? Harold lowered his voice. You know what happens if this becomes public. There it was. Not innocence, not denial, damage control. Edgar studied him carefully. The expensive suit, the gold watch, the controlled breathing. For years, Harold Whitmore treated every room like a boardroom and every human interaction like leverage. Now leverage was disappearing. One question, Edgar said quietly. Harold waited. When were you planning to tell me my name was tied to company debt? Harold hesitated. Tiny hesitation, but real. Then it was temporary exposure. Same phrase again. Temporary. As if attaching someone else's identity to financial risk became acceptable if rich people intended to clean it up later. Edgar nodded slowly. That's what Caroline said. Harold glanced briefly toward his daughter. That movement told Edgar enough. Caroline had known more than she admitted. Maybe not everything, but enough. Harold lowered his voice further. You don't understand how businesses survive difficult quarters. No, Edgar replied calmly. I understand how signatures work. Harold stared at him, probably for the first time in years without automatic superiority filtering his vision. Edgar saw it happen gradually. Recognition, not admiration, recognition. The realization that the quiet HVAC technician he mocked for years had documented enough details to threaten everything Harold built. Across the room, Travis ended another frantic phone call. He walked quickly toward Harold. We need to leave. Harold snapped immediately. Stop panicking. I'm not panicking. You look like you're panicking. Travis lowered his voice harshly. Daniel Reeves already contacted Prairie. Harold's face changed instantly, only for a second. But Edgar saw it. So did Walter. And Walter gave the faintest nod beside him. Confirmation. Pressure point located. Diane stepped closer. What's happening? Neither man answered her immediately. That silence frightened her more than words. Denise closed another folder. Mr. Whitmore, she said calmly, you should preserve every electronic record connected to reimbursement reporting. Harold looked toward her sharply. You're enjoying this far too much. Denise barely reacted. I bill hourly regardless. A few remaining guests almost smiled despite themselves. Harold noticed. Another crack in authority. The room no longer feared him enough to stay fully serious. Caroline finally stood and walked toward Edgar slowly. Not dramatically, almost uncertainly. She stopped beside his chair. Can we talk? Edgar looked up at her. For years he would have followed immediately. Would have prioritized privacy, comfort, repair. Not anymore. You can talk here. Caroline glanced around at the room, at her parents, at Travis pacing again, at Daniel Reeves quietly taking notes. Then back at Edgar. I didn't know it would become this. Edgar studied her face carefully. No makeup could fully hide exhaustion now. What did you think it was? He asked. She swallowed once. Temporary. Again. Always temporary. Temporary transfers, temporary guarantees, temporary lies. Like moral consequences operated on expiration dates. Caroline sat slowly in the chair beside him. For several seconds she simply stared at the tablecloth. Then she spoke softly enough that only Edgar and Walter heard clearly. Travis said the company needed clean guarantors while refinancing projects. Edgar felt something inside him settle colder. Not surprise anymore. Confirmation. You knew they used my name. I thought it was procedural. Walter finally spoke. People committing fraud love procedural language. Caroline flinched slightly. Walter's tone carried no cruelty. Just precision, which made it harder to reject. Caroline looked toward Edgar again. I never thought they'd hurt you, Edgar answered honestly. They didn't think they were hurting me. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means your family stopped seeing me as fully real a long time ago. The sentence landed quietly between them, but Caroline could not deny it, because she remembered every dinner, every joke, every correction, every moment she stayed silent because challenging her family felt inconvenient. Across the room, Diane suddenly approached Daniel Reeves directly. This entire thing is based on paperwork misunderstandings. Daniel closed his notebook. Mrs. Whitmore, misunderstandings don't usually require identity verification irregularities. Diane's composure cracked slightly. You people are treating my family like criminals, Daniel answered evenly. No. Right now, we're treating your family like records. That sentence silenced her immediately. Edgar noticed something then. The Whitmores kept arguing emotionally because emotional power worked inside social rooms, but Daniel and Denise operated structurally. Facts, timelines, verification trails. No amount of confidence changed documentation. Harold sat down heavily for the first time all evening. Not dramatic exhaustion, just weight, real weight. He loosened his tie slightly. The old man suddenly looked older than Edgar remembered. Still dangerous, still calculating, but tired now too. Walter watched him carefully, then quietly asked, How much debt are you carrying? Harold looked up sharply. No answer. Walter nodded once. That much. Travis stopped pacing suddenly. Dad! Harold raised one hand sharply to silence him. Too late. Another leak. Every nervous interruption revealed more. The family, once obsessed with appearing powerful, now looked like strangers trapped inside the same sinking elevator. At 9:52 p.m., Daniel checked his watch again. We're finished for tonight. Nobody moved immediately, because finished did not feel finished. Not really. Daniel gathered his folder. Denise did the same. Walter closed the leather briefcase carefully. Then Caroline looked at Edgar one last time. Not angry anymore. Not superior. Just lost. And Edgar realized something unexpected. For the first time since the divorce began, Caroline finally understood what kind of man she had actually married. Not loud, not flashy, not socially powerful, but patient enough to survive long after arrogant people destroyed themselves. Outside snow continued falling over downtown Des Moines. Inside Blackwood Chop House, the celebration had completely collapsed, and nobody in the Whitmore family knew yet how much worse tomorrow would become. The last guest left Blackwood Chop House just after 10 p.m. By then, the private dining room no longer looked like a celebration. Wine glasses sat half-empty across stained white tablecloths. Melted ice floated in abandoned bourbon tumblers. Dessert plates remained untouched beneath dim amber lighting, while restaurant staff cleaned quietly around the edges of the room without making eye contact. The Whitmores stayed near the center table. Not because they wanted to, because leaving first would feel like surrender. Edgar Foster stood beside his chair, slipping Denise's folders back into the leather messenger bag, while Walter closed the old black briefcase with slow, careful movements. Metal clasps clicked shut. Final. Harold watched the briefcase like it contained explosives. Maybe in a way it did. Not bombs. Documentation. Which was far more dangerous to men like Harold Whitmore. Daniel Reeves finished speaking quietly with Denise near the doorway before preparing to leave. We'll be in contact tomorrow morning, he said evenly. Harold gave a stiff nod. Daniel looked toward Edgar briefly, then toward Walter. Professional acknowledgement. Nothing more. After Daniel and Denise exited, silence settled heavily across the room again. Only 4 Whitmores remained now. Harold, Diane, Travis, Caroline. For the first time in years, Edgar saw them without audience protection. No country club friends, no business associates, no laughing guests to reinforce status, just a family sitting beside the wreckage of their own confidence. Travis broke first. This is unbelievable. His voice sounded raw, now drained of performance. He paced beside the table again, both hands moving through his hair. All this over paperwork. Walter looked at him calmly. No, he said. All this over arrogance. Travis stopped moving. Walter continued quietly. You thought nobody would notice because you decided Edgar wasn't the kind of man who checks details. No yelling, no anger, which made every word land harder. Travis laughed bitterly. You think you're some kind of hero now, Edgar answered before Walter could. No. That confused Travis more than any insult would have. Edgar remained standing beside the table, hands relaxed at his sides. I didn't come here for revenge. Then why come? Edgar looked around the room slowly, at the abandoned plates, at Harold's loosened tie, at Caroline staring silently into nothing. Because you invited me to watch. Nobody answered, because they all understood the truth inside the sentence. This night was supposed to humiliate Edgar publicly. Instead, it exposed the Whitmores privately. Diane finally snapped. You could have handled this quietly. Walter turned toward her. So could your family. Diane's mouth tightened. We protected Caroline. No, Walter replied. You protected yourselves. The old man's voice remained calm the entire time. Not once did he raise it. Edgar realized something watching his father now. Walter never argued emotionally because emotional arguments gave dishonest people room to hide inside feelings. Facts cornered them differently. Harold finally stood again, slowly, like the movement itself required effort now. You've made your point. Walter looked directly at him. No, he said quietly. You made ours. Harold's jaw flexed. For several seconds, the 2 older men simply stared at each other across the table. Different kinds of power. Harold built his through money, influence, reputation. Walter built his through patience, observation, and records. Tonight, only one type remained stable. Harold looked toward Edgar. I underestimated you. There it was. Not apology. Recognition. Late recognition. Edgar thought about all the years behind that sentence, the jokes at dinner, the careful humiliations, the assumption that a man working with tools could not possibly understand financial structures. He almost answered angrily. Almost. Instead, he said no. You underestimated quiet people. That landed deeper than shouting ever could. Harold looked away first. Across the room, Caroline finally spoke again, softly. To be fair, I did too. Edgar turned toward her. She looked exhausted now. Not polished, not composed, just emotionally worn down in a way he had never fully seen before. Caroline rubbed one hand against her temple. I kept thinking you weren't reacting because you didn't understand what was happening. Edgar watched her carefully. No, he said. I understood. I just stopped arguing with people who already decided who I was. Caroline lowered her eyes. That sentence hurt her, not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. Travis scoffed bitterly. Oh, please, don't turn this into some philosophical speech. Walter looked toward him. You still think this is about ego. What else would it be about? Walter paused before answering. Consequences. The words settled heavily into the room. Consequences. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Consequences. Harold finally sat back down heavily. For the first time all evening, Edgar saw genuine age in him. The old man looked tired now. Not socially tired. Financially tired. Like years of maintaining appearances had finally become physically expensive. Walter picked up the briefcase again. Then, unexpectedly, he opened it one final time. Harold stiffened immediately. Walter removed a thin manila folder, smaller than the others. Older. He placed it gently onto the table. What's that? Diane asked quietly. Walter looked toward Harold. Original transfer records from Margaret Foster's life insurance account. Edgar felt something tighten in his chest at his mother's name. Walter slid the folder toward Caroline. She helped buy the Ashbury Lane house, he said calmly. Not your father. Caroline opened the folder slowly. Inside sat bank transfers dated 6 years earlier. Exact amounts. Exact routing numbers. Edgar remembered standing in the bank lobby after his mother's funeral, barely able to focus while signing inheritance paperwork. He never imagined those funds would someday become evidence. Caroline stared at the pages silently. Walter continued. My wife worked 32 years as a public school librarian. His voice remained even. She died believing that money would help her son build a stable life. Nobody spoke. She didn't leave it so another family could erase where it came from. Diane looked away first. Then Caroline closed the folder carefully. I didn't know, she whispered. Walter nodded once. That's part of the problem. Silence again. But softer now. Less hostile, more honest. Travis suddenly pushed back from the table. I'm done with this. He grabbed his coat aggressively. Harold looked up sharply. Sit down. No. Travis. I said no. The room shifted again, fractures widening. Travis looked directly at Harold. Now panic finally overtaking loyalty. You told me it was covered. Harold's face hardened instantly. Watch your mouth. No, you watch yours, Travis snapped. You signed off on half those transfers. Diane gasped quietly. Caroline closed her eyes. Walter simply observed. Pressure revealing structure exactly as expected. Harold stood again. Not here. Wherever than Travis shot back. Because apparently everybody already knows. The son who mocked Edgar all evening now looked terrified of his own father. Interesting how quickly arrogance dissolved once consequences arrived. Edgar picked up the messenger bag slowly. He no longer needed to stay. The room was collapsing on its own now. Walter stood beside him. Then finally, Walter Foster said the thing Edgar suspected he had been holding all night. He looked directly at Harold Whitmore. You spent years teaching people that value comes from appearance. Harold said nothing. Walter continued quietly. My son fixes systems for a living. He notices pressure before things explode. He paused. And you confuse that skill with stupidity. Nobody moved. Nobody argued, because there was nothing left to argue against. Walter placed one hand briefly on Edgar's shoulder. "Come on," he said softly. Edgar nodded once. As they walked toward the restaurant exit, Caroline spoke behind them. "Edgar." He stopped near the doorway but did not turn around immediately. When he finally did, Caroline stood beside the table holding the folder with his mother's transfer records. For a second, she looked like the woman from the hospital fundraiser years ago, before status replaced sincerity. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Edgar studied her face, then answered honestly. "I think you are. Not forgiveness, not cruelty, just truth." Walter opened the restaurant door. Cold Iowa wind rushed briefly into the hallway. As father and son stepped outside into falling snow, Edgar realized something strange. For the first time in years, he no longer felt small around the Whitmores, not because they lost power, because he finally stopped measuring himself against it. Behind them, inside the restaurant, the Whitmore family remained seated among empty glasses and unfinished food. And for the first time in their lives, silence belonged to them instead of Edgar. 3 months after the dinner at Blackwood Chop House, Whitmore Development Group stopped returning calls from reporters. 2 months after that, the company's downtown office removed its illuminated logo from the building lobby overnight. By spring, half the executive floor sat dark after 5 p.m. People in Des Moines noticed. Cities like Des Moines always noticed eventually. Not loudly, quietly. At coffee shops near Grand Avenue. At country club lunches. At charity galas where wealthy people lowered their voices while pretending not to gossip. Whitmore Development was under formal financial review. Prairie State Bank initiated internal compliance investigations tied to guarantor authorizations and reimbursement documentation. 3 civil cases emerged. Then another. No dramatic FBI raid happened. No handcuffs. Real financial collapse rarely looked cinematic. It looked administrative. Frozen approvals. Delayed financing. Attorneys billing by the hour. People who once answered immediately suddenly becoming unavailable. That kind of damage lasted longer. Edgar Foster watched most of it from rooftops and mechanical rooms, exactly where he had always been. On a rainy Tuesday morning in April, he stood atop a medical office building replacing a failed rooftop sensor while thunder rolled somewhere west of the city. His phone buzzed inside his jacket pocket. "Denise Holloway." Edgar answered while tightening a panel screw. "How bad?" Denise laughed softly. "You always skip hello. How bad?" "Prairie's officially released you from all associated guarantor obligations." Edgar stopped moving for a second. Wind pushed cold rain across the rooftop. "You serious?" "Completely." He leaned against the metal housing slowly. For months, the possibility of inherited debt sat in the back of his mind like hidden rot inside a wall. Now it was gone. Just gone. Denise continued. "And the property review ruling came through this morning." Edgar already knew the answer from her tone. "The court recognized your documented financial contributions to Ashbury Lane." He closed his eyes briefly. Not triumph. Relief. Different thing entirely. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "The house will be liquidated unless Caroline buys out your share." Edgar looked across the gray skyline of Des Moines. "Will she—" A pause. "I don't think the Whitmores can afford pride anymore." That sentence stayed with him the rest of the day. Because for years, pride was the Whitmore family's primary currency. Now it had become expensive. Very expensive. By May, Harold Whitmore stopped appearing at public events. Rumors spread first, then facts. Whitmore Development had leveraged too aggressively during a commercial expansion push across central Iowa. Loan structures became unstable after market slowdown and delayed commercial occupancy rates. Travis attempted to patch gaps using temporary guarantor extensions tied to cleaner financial identities, like Edgar's, like 2 smaller subcontractors connected to the company. Unlike Edgar, the subcontractors signed quickly without reading details. One later hired legal counsel after Denise referred him privately. Pressure spread outward. People started talking. Not because Edgar exposed the Whitmores publicly, because documentation eventually exposed them naturally. Walter Foster always said systems moved slowly until they moved all at once. He was right. One afternoon in early June, Edgar stopped by the old Ashbury Lane property one final time after settlement negotiations concluded. The house looked smaller now. Funny how emotional distance changed physical scale. A realtor lockbox hung from the front door. Inside, several rooms already sat half empty. Caroline stood alone in the kitchen when Edgar entered. No makeup, no performance. Just jeans, tied back hair, and visible exhaustion. She looked older somehow, not physically, emotionally. "You came." Edgar nodded once. "Needed the last of my tools." For a moment, neither spoke. Sunlight filtered weakly through the kitchen windows onto the hardwood floors Edgar refinished years earlier. Caroline touched the countertop lightly. They appraised the renovations higher than I expected. Edgar almost smiled. Turns out permits matter. A faint, sad laugh escaped her. Then silence again. Caroline finally looked at him directly. "You know what the worst part is?" Edgar waited. "I spent years believing my family understood the world better than you did." He said nothing, because she needed to finish the thought herself. They were always so confident, she continued quietly. "And you never tried to prove anything." Edgar looked around the kitchen, the recessed lighting, the cabinet molding. The floor he installed while listening to late-night sports radio through earbuds because Caroline liked falling asleep in quiet. "I got tired of proving things to people who already made up their minds." Caroline nodded slowly. "I see that now." Maybe she did. Maybe too late. But genuinely. She walked toward the drawer near the refrigerator and removed an envelope. "What's this?" Edgar asked. "Your mother's recipe cards." He froze slightly. "I found them in storage boxes." Caroline handed over the envelope carefully. She labeled them in her handwriting. Edgar looked down at the faded cards inside. Chicken soup, cornbread casserole, peach cobbler, small ordinary things. For a second, grief hit harder than anger ever had, because his mother trusted Caroline once too. "Thank you," he said quietly. Caroline nodded. Then after a long pause, "I really am sorry." This time, Edgar believed her fully, not because apology fixed anything, because consequences finally removed illusion. He slipped the recipe cards carefully into his jacket pocket. Then he picked up the last toolbox from beside the garage door. Before leaving, he turned once more toward the house. Years earlier, he thought this place represented success. Now it simply looked expensive. And there was a difference. By late summer, Edgar purchased a small craftsman-style house in Ankeny, less than 15 minutes from Walter's place. Nothing flashy. 2 bedrooms, small porch, detached garage. The inspection report listed minor HVAC inefficiencies. Edgar smiled when he read that. The first night there, he sat alone on the porch eating takeout barbecue while cicadas buzzed in nearby trees. No marble countertops. No designer lighting, no anxiety hiding beneath expensive furniture. Just quiet. Real quiet. A week later, Walter came over carrying a toolbox and 2 folding chairs. "You buying furniture anytime soon?" Edgar shrugged. "Eventually." Walter sat beside him on the unfinished porch. For a while, they watched traffic move slowly down the distant road. Then Walter asked, "You regret any of it?" Edgar thought carefully before answering. "The marriage?" Walter nodded. Edgar leaned back slightly. "No." Walter looked surprised. Edgar stared out at the neighborhood. "I regret ignoring things once they stopped feeling honest." Walter nodded slowly. "Fair answer." At 7:40 p.m., they drove to a small diner near Highway 69 called Mary Lou's Kitchen. Red vinyl booths, coffee that never stopped flowing, waitresses who called everybody honey. The kind of place Harold Whitmore would have hated immediately, which made Edgar like it more. Walter ordered meatloaf. Edgar got a patty melt and fries. Simple food, simple evening, no performance anywhere. Halfway through dinner, Walter looked across the booth. "You sleep better now." Edgar smiled faintly. "Yeah, that was the real ending. Not court rulings, not investigations, not the Whitmores losing status. Sleep, peace. The ability to exist without constantly defending your worth against people committed to misunderstanding you." As they left the diner, warm Iowa wind moved through the parking lot beneath fading sunset light. Walter stopped beside Edgar's truck. "You know what your real mistake was?" Edgar raised an eyebrow. "What?" Walter smiled slightly for the first time in weeks. You waited too long to realize you were already enough. Edgar looked out across the quiet highway, then back toward the diner glowing softly behind them. Maybe his father was right. For years, Edgar Foster believed value had to be defended loudly against powerful people. Turns out real value stayed steady, whether anyone respected it or not. And somewhere behind him in empty offices and unfinished legal meetings, the Whitmores were still trying to salvage appearances. But Edgar no longer cared how things looked, only whether they were true. Sometimes the strongest people in a room are not the loudest ones. They are the people who stay calm long enough to see the truth clearly. Edgar spent years being underestimated because he did not brag, argue, or demand attention. People looked at his job, his truck, his quiet personality, and decided his value for him. But patience has power, observation has power, and truth has a way of surviving longer than arrogance ever will. One of the hardest lessons in life is realizing that some people only respect appearances. They mistake money for character confidence, for intelligence, and silence for weakness. But eventually, reality catches up with everyone. The people who build their lives on manipulation spend every day protecting lies. The people who build their lives honestly sleep peacefully at night. That difference matters more than status ever will. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by people who judged you too quickly? Or have you ever stayed silent while someone mistook your kindness for weakness? I'd really like to hear your story. And if you enjoy emotional stories about betrayal, quiet strength, justice, and real-life lessons, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story may remind you why calm people are often the most dangerous to underestimate.